Thomas Jockin and Dimitri and Michelle and Samuel Barnes. Look at all these fine people. It is good to see you. So first off, if you ever are getting a hotel, do not use bookings.com. And let me tell you why. Michelle will speak up. So we get there, okay, and we had to reschedule everything. And we get there, and we call 4 times to make sure the pool's open because the kids were so excited. 4 times, like over and over again, okay? And it was under maintenance. And they, so we're like, oh, okay, well, that's a problem. We'd like to, change the booking. Can we change the date? Can we do a different hotel? Oh, y'all did it through a third party. We can't do it. Okay, so we try to reach bookings. No matter how many times you try to reach bookings, you can't get to them. You can't call them. There's no messages or anything. The manager doesn't call for 20 minutes. And then we say, fine, let's go up to our room. The room was literally trashed. The toilet was undone, anything. And the thing is, it's still been 4 days and we have not heard from bookings. Also, home to suite. Do not use home to suite. Because the thing that's so crazy about it, and then we'll talk about the introduction problem. The thing that's so crazy about it is they say, oh, you have to go through the third party. Well, bookings.com has done everything in their power to make sure you can't do it, right? Like they're literally making it so you can't do anything. So you need to book directly with the hotel. But then when you go there, they, of course, push you onto a third platform or different things like that. So it's all just, they're using technology. It's very interesting how technology is used to avoid responsibility. Like that's an interesting, I'm curious about, do we increasingly have the experience that technology is used to like avoid responsibility? Mr. Jockin, please.
I know you're venting, but there's some good shit right here. No, this is exactly the problem. I mean, yeah, this is exactly, okay, part one. Let's start with the first part. The part one is obviously a lot of these startups, a lot of these tech companies, what they did was they used to have very, like the Zappos model. They had extremely good customer service.
Yeah.
So their model proposition was basically they would let human beings manage any conflict or issues that the technology would result in.
Yep.
And they would immediately resolve it like rapidly, right? And actually built a lot of trust because people had huge trust issues with technology. So human intervention was being used as a way to mediate. He's frozen. No, he came back. All right, so universal justice being applied to all cases, and then but we had the equitable, which is the individuation to the particular need. And that's what customer service is supposed to address that point, right? So what's happened now is that basically it's been a general collective agreement that customer service is a net loss for organizations, and to optimize for profit, we need to remove externalities that are not directed towards profit capitalization, making profit, which includes moving human beings to AI robots and chat boxes and things being things having like 20 minutes. I'm impressed you got 20 minutes. Listen, I'll give you a story. I paid for parking. I used a third-party service to pay for parking in Atlanta. So because I wanted to know, like, where am I going to park? I don't want to deal with the uncertainties. I'll pay ahead of time at this lot. I know I need to go. I'm going to park there and I'm all good. I paid for the service. I park at the spot. I verify I'm in the spot. And they just say, park in the spot. You're good. You don't have to check with anybody there. You just park your car and you go on, do your thing. I come back to my car. It's been double booted. Hit with the sticker. You've been booted. And then when I try to go, there's been a mistake. There's no person in the lot. So I can't talk to anybody. I try to call them. They're like, oh, that's cool. First of all, you're going to have to call back. You're going to like talk to a manager line and go to that. I have to wait 30 minutes for that. And then I get told they get back to you in 2 weeks. I'm like, are you kidding me? And I had to be somewhere and my car is booted. So guess what I had to do? I had to pay. To get my boot removed. It was double booted. Had to get those things removed. Thank God, apparently the guy who does the servicing was apparently in the area, because he could have theoretically been on the other side of town. I could have been stuck there for hours waiting for this boot to get removed. Luckily, it was only 5 minutes. Thank God. Very automated, very effective. I get the text messages to tell me. Oh, and by the way, also the credit card processing failed twice on me, and then my bank thought it was fraud. So then my card got frozen, and then I had to unfreeze the card. I talked to my girlfriend at the time. I was like, this is dystopia. This is the future we were not promised, and this is what we got instead. Anyway, so boot got removed. It took basically 2 weeks for tech service to finally get back to me to go, oh, you've been refunded. But I'm looking at them like, bullshit, just refunded? That's all I'm going to get from this? this seems like this dysfunction, like cost to remedy is not equitable in any sense. Anyway, so I'm not surprised, Daniel, about your story. I've seen this play out, and this shown in all industries. I'm trying to think of another. I had another example. There was we were relying on these platforms and services, which are always third party. Another example is a lot of times there's an update. There's an update to a platform you're using, like some infrastructure. I was just talking to a colleague of mine in graphic design. Her website was on a very old PHP platform. They updated one aspect of it. It blew up the entire site got destroyed because it could not deal with the new update software. Oh yeah, the CrowdStrike. Yes, that exactly. Like this is the feature we've been given. I'm also thinking about this because it's been a lot of talk of ethics being moved to protocols and trajectories. That's what they're called. So this is almost, we're seeing a live use case of how there are limits to technological scale, and that human direct judgment needs to be applied. And usually the problem is when human error judgment does come again involved, we push it further and further up the chain, so it cannot be addressed at the small scale. So it's fragility. We've introduced more fragility. Now I know you want to talk about I agree with you, the introduction problem in education. I'm very excited about this, but you have this rant about technology you want to talk about. I'm on board for that. So I'm going to stop.
Well, this topic is fascinating. I mean, I'll give it to Mr. Bob because it's interesting, because it goes to show you things have an inverse relationship that you wouldn't think have an inverse relationship. Like, for example, who would have thought that increased efficiency would lead to lesser responsibility? Right? There's nowhere that necessarily usually you would think, oh, efficiency is going to make more responsibility because it's easier to do things and people would be able to step in. But actually, and this, one could say this is the reason why philosophy has a role, is paying attention to the common life of the certain trade-offs that are occurring that you don't even think would occur. And then when they start occurring, you better be paying attention or you end up in trouble, right? Like, that's what's so, for me, again, and then I'll give it to Mr. Barnes. What's so fascinating with this is the fix is quite easy, right? We're just reschedule, no problem, or move to a different chain, right? No, we can't do it because it's outside the protocol, right? And I think that, I've heard a few philosophers say how we've replaced, judgment with law. The judge just says, what does the law say? Mr. Wing, good to see you, sir. So likewise, you have this notion of ethics with protocol. And then, of course, it's the idea of, oh, well, we'll just pay you back. No. There's a time inefficient, I need an Olive Garden coupon. I need the payment back and an Olive Garden coupon to at least feel as if we've done okay here, right? Can you at least get your Sunday paper with a pair of scissors and cut out the Olive Garden coupon and say, in addition to the refund, we on the house 50% off of your thing. But it's interesting because, again, I'll give it to Mr. Barnes, in running spaces for a long time, it is very interesting the difference between local, on the ground, not corporate structures, and their ability to go, hey, we're going to take care of it. Boom, this is what we're going to do. Boom. And the corporate's we're so sorry. There's nothing we can do. It's just, we're so sorry. I actually talked in that voice. Let me get to Mr. Barnes. Mr. Barnes, it is so good to see you.
Guys, coming off the back of writing a lot of fiction, really, my mind is for once in the world of fiction and not in the world of philosophy theory, which is good. But what I wanted to say, adding on to your story, which is a story, but there are millions of them, unfortunately, is that this is the one thing that I think Kafka missed, is that his hell sort of came from other people. And I think the one thing he missed in a lot of his stories a lot of his stories have the absence of technology. And I think it's gotten to a point in the technological nightmare where, I actually would like, generally speaking, if it's possible, I'd pay a premium to talk to a person. And where, Kafka's hell is other people, our hell seems to be machines. And the bureaucratic system seems to be all these immovable pieces of technology, which, like Daniel said, has apparently made things more efficient. And they do, if it works, they're more efficient, but they often don't. I think that instead of thinking of technology as linear line of progress, we need to kind of think of it as a back and forth, because often, I think that this one side of technology, the customer service side, that actually getting a person involved side is just completely died for some reason. And I think we need to think about progress of technology is more of a back and forth between that. I mean, Tom, I know you're a fonts guy, but I think you likely are a web guy as well. You'll know that, most of the web, it actually comes out. It's a stream of these tags, which is called HTML, which is like a markdown language, and it's basically just like a schema for how the elements on the page what the elements on the page are actually. And most of the time, what comes out on the web browser you're looking at is actually broken HTML, like actually invalid. And what the web browser is doing is it's doing its best job to kind of make that work. Now, this is a deliberate design decision in the very early like web browser HTML implementation had all that HTML coming out, and if it wasn't completely perfectly structured and valid, it would just not show anything and give you like a big error message, as if you'd written like a poor piece of code. And the problem is this in the internet, especially once you actually start doing dynamic stuff with it, is this big dynamic machine which is spewing out all these tags. And what we've got is a very strange system of markdown and style sheets, and frankly, just like bits of JavaScript code that are essentially run globally, kind of duct taped together and WD-40 here and there, sort of stuff. And like, it's like, if you were to design a perfect thing to make the web on, you would never in a million years choose the system we've got. But unfortunately, it's the system we've ended up with. I think this extrapolates out even further. Like, look at the human animal, right? If you were to design a creature to do the things that you want a human animal to do, you would never, ever design it in the way that we are like built. Like, for some reason, it's on two legs. Its ankles break really easily. It hasn't like, sometimes it's got really good upper body strength, but if you make it too stressed out, it starts to get heart problems. And, it's just like, you would never design this shit. So yeah, I don't know. I think that Kafka would wince at what we've got right now, and I think he would be longing for the bureaucratic hell, which is other people. So there you go.
I appreciate that very much. Actually, Kafka and bookings.com would be the perfect, I'll give it to Mr. Luber, would be the perfect story, because it's like reaching customer services bookings is getting to the castle, and no one's ever seen the castle. It's like, no, there is one, I promise you. And it's like, you never actually get to it. It's like, there's no people at bookings.com, is there? And you just die out there. I do also think of the movie Brazil. I always liked Brazil as kind of like what takes over is the bureaucracy and the paperwork. And that scene where the guy at the end is buried under papers and dies, it definitely feels like that. And it does feel like a South Park episode. But this is the point, I think, what you're getting at, and I'll give it to Mr. Luber and then Mr. Jockin. The idea of this oscillation between trade-offs, because there is something like, I get from work, when someone comes up to you, whether it was at the wholesale, it's like, hey, these roses are dead. Would you like to explain to me why you shipped them to us for a wedding day? The first thing you want to say is, it was Armelini's fault. They sent them. They were dead. It was Armelini's. There's a human tendency, very easy to go, them. And, you could speak of a scapegoat mechanism or different things like that. I sometimes wonder if the scapegoat mechanism is a kind of broader sort of like, it's almost like technology as a bureaucracy has a certain scapegoat function, but it's the scapegoat that never dies. So it's like perfect. It's always there to take responsibility, but it never dies. So it's like the perfect scapegoat. And I do wonder in this sense if the idea of, well, the scapegoat doesn't work anymore because of after Christ, and that's the whole idea of the sacred violence and so on. Well, yes, but I wonder if the scapegoat has been hidden as bureaucracy in a way, because it's what we blame, this system that's above us that we cannot control. And I really do think one of the key trade-offs there is this kind of idea of efficiency and responsibility. It just goes to show you, I love the idea. So basically, like the internet with all the broken HTML code, it's like bookings.com when everything goes right, but then you're like, hey, they screwed us. And then it all, like the veil is torn, like in the temple when Jesus dies, you see behind it like, oh my gosh, it's a nightmare. It's like the death. It's like the techno Easter or something. But the techno Good Friday or something. And you see all the broken madness behind it. But let me give it to Mr. Luber and then Mr. Jockin. Mr. Luber, how you doing, sir? Do you have a bookings.com story? Because we're gonna all get free hotel for life. They're gonna see this and be like, "Oh, frick, we got to get this down."
I have like a airline story
Oh,
where,
those are good. Yeah, those are
basically
good.
the same thing, system down, can't get on the flight. Oh, can't really pay you back either. System's down. You'll have to wait. Um, Nice and simple story there. But this this notion about more efficiency and the relationship between efficiency and responsibility, that was very provocative. It's making me think. Uh, I wrote this too long of a note. I hate when I do that. When you're like taking things down, and it's like typically it's good when you have like a little line or something that triggers. But this time I don't know what the hell I was thinking. Anyway, basically it seems like efficiency has responsibility when everybody involved in what's making it efficient has stakes. So when you have technology, when you have basically something that's involved in the situation that can't have stakes in it, but it's used as a medium in order for the parties to have stakes in it, that creates a problem, which leads to the question about progression and technology and that relationship. So if you have that situation in mind, and then you think about that question, for me, the question is simply saying, the efficiency is for the sake of something that's progressing for something that's not human. So the consequence to that will always ultimately be some type of immediate lack, because what the median is used for is something that ultimately the motivation, the drive for that isn't human. Like not human, but it's not not human, but it's non-human. And because I think we have the ability to contort and orient ourselves in that situation to manipulate this medium, because it's related to human, but it's not in itself human. And because we have this ability to contort and manipulate it, we have to basically find a different orientation to how we want this medium to be used. And the problem with that, though, is I don't see how, when you think about technology, how you can separate that from progression. And progression in the sense that it's progressing towards something that's non-human, like explicitly, instead of. So what that means would be the ability to manipulate it seems very unlikely, because the progression is toward something that's non-human, and the progression really doesn't have anything directly associated with us in terms of what's motivating the medium. Like what's allowing the medium to exist is the fact that we have these human parties using them. But in terms of what's actually motivating the behavior, that's funny. Oh my God, that was a really funny South Park episode. But what's allowing, right, we're allowing this mediator to be there, but what's motivating the mediator isn't the people that are participating in it, which is interesting. So I wonder, how do we address that problem? Maybe, Daniel, somewhere in the 5,000 pages, it's there, the answer. But the only thing that I can think of is not almost like Ludditerian in a certain sense, where you're just not having it be the medium. in that type of way. Like you make it the medium in a different situation, maybe not like a medium. The problem is, I don't think you could pick and choose which situation you can put that medium, this type of medium in. I think it's like if you put this in one medium, it has to ipso facto be in all mediums. So yeah, I'll pass it off.
No, that's delightful, and Mr. Barnes, that is definitely. I'm gonna have like a baby seal be the cover picture. It's outstanding, and we need to. It's really interesting because what I hear in that, and I'll give it to Mr. Jockin and Michelle, is kind of this idea that if you remove the human element from technology, then you really don't even have a standard by which to determine what is progress and what is not, because it's like it's its own thing. So what is progress for us, right? Like, it's almost like you have to maintain some sort of stakes with the technology as opposed to using it as a scapegoat, or else it's not even clear what is progress, right? Because it doesn't have any sort of connection with the human element. It starts to eclipse the human element, which almost by definition seems like it can't be human progress. Maybe it's Nick Land progress, but not human progress. And what's very interesting is, well, this would suggest, I guess, as a general heuristic, maybe, so it, we're basically speaking, I would assume I always take virtue as not avoiding responsibility. So if technology is used to avoid responsibility, there is something viceful about that. But then that also means virtue and existential tension go together. So if you're using technology to avoid existential tension, ergo in the form of responsibility, that seems to be a problem. Oh, and this also, though, suggests something very interesting, in my opinion, is that if responsibility brings with it a certain existential anxiety, if you're not willing to go through anxiety, you're fragile. Like, anxiety is precisely what you go through to develop anti-fragility. And what we have now is if technology is used for this sort of outsourcing of responsibility, there's the anxious generation that Jonathan Haidt put out, all these different people. There's a way in which, you either go through anxiety or you end up fragile, which then, funny enough, it's almost like the difference between anxiety to the anxiety of responsibility to anti-fragility, or the avoiding of responsibility leading to the anxiety of fragility. Maybe there's a different word than anxiety used in that second sense, but it's interesting how, like, there's something that's going on. It's like if you're going to outsource responsibility to the technology, then the cost is fragility. And it would seem as if the human being made more fragile, that would not seem progressive. One would assume that being more fragile is not progress, and I would assume that's safe to say, unless one is sick and twisted or something. But, I guess with time you have to enjoy Kafka. You have to laugh at it. Otherwise it, just becomes sad. But let me give it to Mr. Jockin and Michelle. Mr. Jockin.
Yes, fun times. So Samuel, yes, the idea of basically redundancy, right? Or backwards, basically that you can have a complete incompetence on the web infrastructure. And by the way, like, I just posted a link to a channel I just recently found on YouTube. Apparently it's a back-end developer who's just given these archival histories of massive platforms chronically failing from just the stupidest errors in code on back-end, like whole websites, like millions of dollars lost. Entire infrastructure shut down because of one line of code got messed up or opted out, or proper protocols were not followed in development. I'm just thinking about the idea here of, right, this is all the danger, like this, we're all aware this is the danger of optimization. And the thing is, actually, Luber, your point about this as being non-human, yeah, if the Marxists have any claim of capital actually being this abstraction that has real reality, this is the example of it. Because what's the orientation? All the optimization here is for capital. That's what it's all about. And by the way, both in terms of its boon and bust, in the sense of, like, speculative capital got imposed into these tech startups at a certain time duration, and it led to a certain development. Oh, and as Daniel pointed out, in owning specific domains and areas, like some areas had absolutely no correspondence to the, like, you filing a policy does not work towards profit. It's actually a liability for the company, for the insurance company. So as a result, what's their incentive to optimize that? Jack zero from a capital point of view. And by the way, established by law. Like, again, corporations have a legal requirement to optimize for a profit. That's their existence. That is what they're for. And that's what they're optimized for. And their officers have to be oriented towards that. So this is the system doing what it needs to do. Yeah, and then these developments are basically unequally distributed. And basically the problem, actually really the biggest problem with capital is when it shoots for short term, especially short-term windows of optimization for profit. Because then what happens is the issues of redundancy, slack, maintenance, backwards compatibility, these are all things that are time-oriented towards the past, no? And for potential risks in the future that don't actually contribute to getting profit, it's about preventing harm. Oh, look at that. Versus getting the new, basically these kind of neomaniac kind of orientation to basically making things optimized for some future use, right? Basically, and optimizing removes slack. So like all these things that supposedly costs money that prevent profit, right? They get obscured out and just put to the background. This is a classic example of lack. They're treating lack as nothing. So this is an example of the good, basically overpowering the beautiful, clearly being demonstrated, and lack being demonstrated again. It's like these are things that are existent, right? But because they're not oriented towards that profit motive optimization, they're treated as nothing until there's a problem. And then here we go. And everything plays out the way it does. So those are just the big dynamics about this. And by the way, even in my own discipline, there was a recent catastrophe, like a controversy the last month or two. We have a professional organization in graphic design called American Institute for Graphic Artists, AIGA. It had a publication called Ion Design. It's been around, it was around for 10 years online as a publication. It's defunct. No one's publishing more articles, but the articles did exist, right? And it had a huge collection in there. Basically, the leadership there decided to remove it. They're just like taking off unplugging from the internet, gone. They made some arbitrary choice about some articles being carried over, but they're not clear about what the governance was for that. And basically, people were culturally, I mean, graphic design was a huge uproar about it, because this is a decade of thought in our discipline, and the ideas and the thoughts and the processes and development just omitted now. And the answer, we know what the answer was actually. The AIGA is actually really important. The answer about like why they did, like what the answer was for this. Oh, it's fine. Just use the Wayback Machine to get access to it. Again, defer it to another entity. And within the group, it was both in terms of, wait a minute, we're going to really let the Wayback Machine be the way we're going to record our tradition, record our discipline historically. There's that issue. And then also what's that cultural meaning about this? Because part of a discipline's value is that we're worth holding in memory that we exist. God forbid. Like that's actually one of the roles of history, is to say we matter and we are account of our past matters. Let alone the fact that he who has no past has no future. Right? I use those kind of proverbs to talk about this. So thus, there was actually a very grassroots movement to basically archive all those articles on an open source platform. It was done in 24 hours. It's very interesting. Just observing, but I just want to point this out, like on this thread of like basically externalities, kind of deferment technologies, removal of redundancies, and slack, and these are clearly optimizing for certain goods that are structured and reinforced by policy and law. So I've been kind of chewing on these old parts, and that leads to the biggest part, which is I'm going to try to swag us back to what I want to talk about with you, Daniel, which is the introduction problem. Because that's what education is supposed to be about. Like education has exactly these same problems. Do you know how many education platforms are reliant on third-party services? Not just for infrastructure. Like all of them are using Canvas, like they're using third-party platforms for their educational delivery of content and grading and all the other mechanisms. But beyond even that, the actual content of the classes almost always are deferments. One can make an argument and critique that, like the issue of like teachers who teach from the textbook is a kind of mode of that, where they defer, like the teachers now externalize actual cognitional thought and let the textbook do the work for them instead. I've seen online education, that kind of procedure. And again, it leads to serious points of like, why are we in school for basically effectively the instructor to be legally, like in terms of its actual apparatus of what is being employed to do, is to be a delivery device for other content and to grade and evaluate the student. Like that's our function in terms of what the protocol is in the schools. And our relationship with the universities. That's our relationship. Is that optimization towards the good, like the beauty? I don't think so. Especially in education, it's certainly a good, right? But is it not? Is it beauty? I don't know about that. So yeah, those are just points. I'm gonna try to tip us back over to that question of introduction problem.
No, I think it's very related, because so much of our inability to deal with the problem that 30 students gathered together have never met with one another and don't know how to relate, thus there's an introduction problem, is taken care of with the protocol of the classroom. So it's a way that you cover it. You externalize to it. Where likewise, if you theoretically could overcome the introduction problem of everyone in a city where you were getting a hotel and you were to know who you could trust or not, you may not be as reliant on bookings.com, right? There's something about the introduction problem and then the losing of the human element that makes you a slave of efficiency that is a major problem. So I think those things absolutely go together. I'll give it to Michelle to tell her story with bookings.com or whatever else she wants to do to throw the phone across the room. Well, there was also something too where, yeah, I mean, just burn down the Library of Alexander. Just go talk to all the people that read the books. It's fine. We don't need the library anymore. There's lots of people who read those books. Or get a time machine, or just wait till people who are born who rewrite them. Okay, just wait over enough time. The books will be rewritten. It's fine. We don't need it. I wish they would have told you, just get a time machine. Just go back in time. It will be fine. Yeah, thank you. But that's sort of like, but again, to this notion of optimization, what's so interesting about that is to the point with capital, and then I'll give it to Michelle. If you could theoretically create a industry like bookings.com, and the only way to get a hotel was to go through them, and if you ever tried to get refunded for bad service, you couldn't get the money back, but then you still use their services because you had no choice, that seems like really optimal for corporate structures, right? And if nobody can solve the introduction problem, well, then you're also stuck with the corporate structure of managing information and, you know, the knowledge proof problem and stuff like that, right? So that's the issue, is that optimization is relative to who you ask what is optimal, right? Like, you know, and that's a problem. Yeah, it tastes like, does it have like a tuna kind of, like a kind of hot tuna? That's what I'm going for, Mr. Barnes. So it's like the introduction problem, I think, is tied. But Michelle, tell about the wonderful experience that you had with bookings.com or whatever you're thinking about, because we really had a wonderful time with our children dressed in swimming suits, ready to get into the pool that we asked about 4 times, only to find that it was closed. Miss Michelle.
Well, I mean, the thing is that this has all been great, and it is asking some very important questions regarding technology, efficiency, et cetera. And it will be interesting to think about how the topics relate, because in some ways it seems like, well, if we identify an introduction problem, then isn't that about efficiency? So we're talking about the problems of efficiency, right, in these types of apps and whatnot. But yeah, I think that it's tricky, right, because like, bookings.com did not realize that the front desk man, no offense, dropped the ball. And it's just this weird thing where, yeah, bookings didn't realize, like, it's this odd thing where they leave it in the middle. So nobody's responsible, right? Because, well, we can't touch the booking. And bookings.com doesn't know that the people at the hotel are going to drop the ball. So then, there's just no fault. There's nobody you can really blame, and you can't get anything back from anybody. And it's just, what's that, baby? Mm. Well, ask Gracie, because she knows where it is. So anyways, but it does make me think, like, because when we talked about the introduction problem, right, there's this idea of like, wow, we're not being very efficient because all this intro stuff you could literally maybe have learned on YouTube, probably. So are we wanting efficiency or not? But at the same time, when we have to make a plan B and you walk into a nice hotel with sweet little Maddie at the front desk and she's like, I'm so sorry, let me see what we can do for you. And let me check you in immediately. And let me let you swim at the pool a little bit longer. Like, that was such a godsend. And it's like, wow, that was very efficient. That was very nice. And it makes you kind of wonder, like, I don't want to use apps ever again. I just, you just want to talk to people, but at the same time, like, apps make me think of money in the reduction where, like, if you're going to a country and you can't speak the language, but you could use the app because they put it in English, then there's a way to solve that, like, issue, right? Because you couldn't just go talk to the people because they speak Taiwanese or something. You know what I mean? So it's just, anyway, thank you for listening. And it's all good, it's a nice opportunity to practice grace and flexibility.
Well, but there's a few things. So first off, the context also is that we had something that the children were really, really looking forward to, that sources outside of our control killed. So the payoff was like, okay, well, we'll make up for it with a pool, right? And so we called 4 or 5 times to make sure it was the case, and then it wasn't. And then also the room was not even together. So it became quite crazy. Yeah. And again, we run spaces. Like, so the other thing too, is there was no issue until it was, there's nothing we can do. Like, if they would have said, we're very sorry, that was the issue. Because we run space for a very long time, and air conditioners break, stuff breaks, no problem. We can be reasoned with. But when you start, the issue is when you say, yeah, sorry, nothing we can do because of the technology. That's the difference. Nothing we can do is the luxury of a giant corporate structure. If you as a small business say there's nothing we can do, you're doomed. You are completely going to be reviewed into oblivion and killed, right? And you cannot do that. You must make it work. And so again, the nothing we can do, which is a common thing you see in these technological bureaucracies, that's the thing that is the increasing dimension of modern life. There's nothing we can do. There's nothing we can do, which is the luxury of a giant corporate structure. And I do think it's the same as the introduction. I do think it connects to the introduction problem, because colleges are like, yeah, we'd like to teach the great books, but there's nothing we can do because these kids don't read. There's nothing we can do because of the grading. The whole education structure has a certain, there's nothing we can do. There's nothing we can do. Whereas if you're, say, the parents with your children and your kids aren't learning what this, but you can't do there's nothing we can do because you have skin in the game, right? And you're also, so that what's very interesting is more and more, there is an interesting idea where human progress, and also to your point, Michelle, I think the introduction problem is the difference between human technology and a relationship efficiency versus technological efficiency at the expense of humanity. But this is the problem. What is efficiency and optimization? You need to think of those differences. There is a big difference between trying to use YouTube, liminal web, Zoom, and things like this to deal with the introduction problem, where people are up to speed with one another when they come into a classroom, so you're not as reliant on a protocol, or people already have a sense of the individuals they're meeting because they've seen them on YouTube. Like, that's the thing. We'll constantly have conversations with people I'm talking to, like Matt Segal. I spoke with Matt, really had a great time at VoiceCraft. I've never spoken to Matt, and yet I felt like I knew him because I had watched his videos, read his book. There's an introduction problem that is taken care of that allows the acceleration of the network effect, which the network effect is so much of what's critical for human progress, not just technological progress. That's very different than the progress of systems that allow you to say there's nothing we can do. And that characteristic of there's nothing we can do, like that helplessness, that learned helplessness, seems to be more and more of what is defining people. I guess that's the difference. Like, it's not the progress. It's increasingly not the case that progress equals people saying, man, we can do anything. It's more of progress equals people saying there's nothing we can do. They may claim in a small talk that technology enables us to do anything, but under pressure, when stuff doesn't go right, that's not how we are. Where no, there's nothing we can do. And really, the future is decided by what you do under pressure when things go wrong, not when things go right, when they go wrong, because that's what determines if you're anti-fragile, able to think creatively on your feet, right? And more, I think we have a society that's trained in when things don't go right to say there are systems we cannot control, right? And so then that really removes the human element. And you know, maybe the bar will be Zizek, but it's like, I prefer not. Every time bookings, like we have a deal, I'll just say, I prefer not to. That will be our rebellion. Zizek will be pleased. I'll wear that t-shirt, right? But let me give it to Mr. Luber and then Samuel Barnes. Mr. Luber.
This has been a hilarious net for me. I don't think I've laughed as hard. I love it. I love it. I want to circle back to what Jockin was saying, and then tie that into this efficiency introduction. And like, so plenty of times, like Daniel has talked about like non-rational, and basically, I'm curious where the whole concept of having a dash between non-dash rational or dash whatever, or like with my book, my original thing, story dash telling, there's something with the dash that seems to be overlooked. And I'm curious whether having a sense of this dash, being able to implement and express this dash, has to relate to do with, does it relate with beauty, in the sense that if you are expressing the dash, then you're understanding and unfolding which can only occur if you have a certain perspective of beauty. So I'm curious about that. And if that is the case, then the introductory problem is a simple language issue where there's a lack of prioritizing this dash in how one mediates what they take in and how they express to themselves and to others their world around them, essentially. So I'm just thinking, if it's a language problem, does that mean education needs to have a serious look at language and how we raise kids in terms of, I mean, there's a certain repetition when you have a baby. You know, it's like, say mom, say dad, like you say it over and over again with a baby. I can't picture a world where we have an education of repetition with children where we implement this dash in some way. Like, how do we have a repetition in children that encapsulate this dash sentiment if everything that I was saying is true? If it's not, you know, push back, whatever. But like, that's what I'm thinking. And if that is the case, and let's say there is a way to have this type of repetition in children with encapsulating this dash problem, how would that change the introduction of a classroom? What would that look like? That I just wanted to say that. And yeah.
Beautiful. And we definitely need to get Owen and Hanson to talk Virilio with bookings.com. That'll be great. Because who know, when they invented the bookings, they invented the angry net 111. You know, invent the ship, you get the shipwreck. You know, invent bookings.com, you get net 1111. The truth of bookings.com comes out. I really like what you're saying on the dash. I'll give it to Barnes and Jockin. You know, I've never read, to my great shame, the book on Hegel called The Dash that Zizek liked, where it ends. And there is this kind of notion, and I love what Dimitri is saying on the dash and the thought. That's so really interesting. Definitely, I would associate the dash with the network effect, because the dash has this keeping of the thought. And what we were saying is that I'll pick it up, Dimitri, I need to, is that what we were saying at the Parallax course the other day is that you always have this introduction problem. When you first meet people, you don't know who they are, you're trying to figure out what they've read and so on and so forth. And it can take, like, you know, 3 years to really get up to speed with people. And the thing is, now with like the liminal web and different things, you can actually do the introduction of people before you've ever met them. And then here's the other critical part. Like, if I were to talk about, say, belonging again with Luber, well, without it recorded, I'd have to have 10 different conversations with 10 different people, the exact same thing. So that's an extra 3 hours, you know, maybe 200 hours of time. And then the network effect could occur between all of those different people, right? So what you have in education is an effort of basically professors teaching the same thing over and over again to get people up to a similar speed. And then you could have the network effect, right? And that's the introduction problem that leads to great inefficiency of the ability to think in terms of network, dialogos, conversation, stuff like that, right? So this new technology of the liminal web can help deal with this introduction problem too, right? I would definitely say that the introduction problem, you're trying to, in introduction, actually get to a kind of dash where I know you so much that you can finish my thoughts before I finish them, right? Like, there's a kind of human element that is alive that I'm always dashing into, if I use that metaphorically, right? And I do think there's a sense of the dash and beauty and lack are kind of going together, because there's a notion of whatever I say, there's a certain, like, is that what Andrew heard? Is that what Jockin heard? What did they hear? How did they take it? What did they create with it? There's always a kind of passing that has things move. And we've talked about it before. What in the Platonic dialogue, you're orbiting, right? There's something you're orbiting. So there's something about the dash that you can associate with the space of the human element or the exchange that opens up to the beauty. So likewise, when I go to bookings.com, I would like there to be a dash between the human and the technological. So if the technological fails, I can reach a human and get it in 3 seconds, something that would be really easy to do, like reschedule or give me all we want is an Olive Garden coupon, bookings.com. If you are hearing this, we want breadsticks. If you give us breadsticks, we can be at peace, but we need a freaking Olive Garden coupon. There's nothing we can do. We really want to, but we are helpless. Mr. Luber, please.
The problem with educating children on the sentiment of dash is because the dash doesn't just take into account the unfolding. It takes also into account a particular aspect that's necessary for the unfolding, like an emotional like patience, a certain orientation. So it's like you can't just say mommy, 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 and then they get it. That's the problem. But at the same time, we need to have something that encapsulates this and be able to have this say mommy, say mommy, say mommy motion. Like that's the only way. Like I mean, you have three kids that every time they've said their first word, I'm sure it wasn't because they just were sitting in a dark room and then suddenly they just said a word. It was because they kept hearing the words over and over again. So it's the only way. Exactly. Maybe you did. Maybe.
No, I was reading Redwall in a bathtub. No, there's a certain domestication to a dash, actually. Like you have to be domesticated to the dash. You have to be trained to the dash. But the problem is most training is at the expense of the dash, right? And it's very hard to do that. But we're in an age where, like, the issue is that you have to train to the dash. You have to use technology without losing the human relationship, right? And that's why the human element is very important, because if there's a certain judgment on when that transition occurs, that seems like it is necessarily a human judgment, not a technological judgment, right? When would technology judge, oh, they're ready for the desk now, right? Because it could change per child to child. That's the whole problem. We make a standard that everyone meets, and then the law can lose that individuation, as Jockin was saying at the beginning, right? So the dash requires this kind of human element to say, okay, now they can do it. And a good example, and then I'll give it to Barnes here, of why we need the dash and the human element, because Mr. Barnes has brought to our attention that the breadsticks are free. So bookings.com had an opening to take further advantage of us by giving us a coupon for free stuff. But thanks to Mr. Barnes, we won't allow that now. We need an eggplant parmesan. That includes the soup and the breadstick. So we need a coupon for an eggplant parmesan. Two, actually. It should be two. No, it should be, look, we'll compromise. Eggplant parmesan, and you get that $5.99 lunch thing that you get with an entree in the summer. That too. Okay. Oh, and we can be cool. Mr. Barnes, please.
I'm learning more about Olive Garden than ever, that's for sure. Which, as a Brit, is wonderful. You know, I love learning about foreign cultures. I feel so worldly today. It's wonderful. I'm kind of rewinding a little bit to technology, but what I've realized over the last year is you can kind of opt out of stuff. Two things that have been really useful for my mental health. One thing has been like barely following the news, like barely following the news. Just occasionally, like I glanced at the US tab and the UK tab on the BBC News website. Not that I particularly like BBC News, but because it kind of gives you a pulse of what like the big mouthpiece is saying from my perspective anyway. The other thing is, unlike a previous life where I was in like an airport every other week, I haven't been in an airport for like almost a year now. And that's been great for my mental health. Like seriously, like in a way, like an airport is probably if I was to give an antithesis of everything I would normally assert, ethically, politically, aesthetically, it would be an airport. That would be the antithesis to everything that I would aspire to. So yeah, that's been great for me personally. Another thing about the opting in and out of technology thing is I resent, I suppose, anyone who's really into tech usually just thinks if you're being you don't really care about it, you want to go and run off with the Irish people. I don't think that's true. People get really funny about very small things. Like I'm about to downgrade my phone, and I'm not saying like I'm going to go back to like a Nokia or like a Motorola Razr or anything, but I'm going to buy I bought one of these Samsung flip ones, okay? And I really regret it. It was a really stupid purchase. I bought it because I had more money at the time, and I saw the advert on TV and I thought it was cool. That's the reason why I bought it. It was a stupid purchase and I shouldn't have bought it. So I'm buying like a crappier Samsung phone because I don't mind, because like it's not that I like Samsung phones, but they're kind of like, you know, it's rather the devil I know than the devil I do. I'm buying like the crappier Samsung phone. So I have a smartphone, but I don't have like all the worry about like dropping this thing, which happens to me all the time. And I don't, all those little things. But one thing I didn't think at the time, but it's come to my mind over this conversation, is that I was on a meditation retreat last weekend, and it was a big meditation retreat. It was like 150 people, and it was in this big like complex. which is like a very modern complex. You know, it was very hot here, so it had like aircon and stuff like that. So like it wasn't like going, you know, you're going out to the middle of the mountains and whatever. But it's like it's not like the rooms had television and that sort of stuff, and it's not like, you know, everyone was expected to lock their phones up outside, but no one was ever sitting on their phone. Like a phone would come out if someone wanted to take a photo or a video, or you wanted to exchange contact information with someone. It just, now that I think about it, you know, in lots of ways it was a pretty great weekend, but in terms of technology, it was almost like where I would put it ideally, like it's the ideal use of technology. And unfortunately, and this is kind of the dark point here, is, and this kind of goes for the booking.com thing, you know, we kind of get the technology we deserve, okay? Like we're the sort of people who go, we look at our phone, we got all these crappy apps, and then we're surprised that the algorithm is trained to our darkest and most base impulses. And we complain, we have the audacity to complain about this. Like we willingly consume this content, and we have the audacity to complain that the algorithm is giving us exactly what we want, you know? So it's really, I suppose that's more of an elitist point, but that's the truth, unfortunately. One amusing thing though is that, you know, despite like disconnecting from a lot of this stuff, the one thing they can get through to you, they could do those emergency alerts from your phone, which was quite funny a couple of weeks ago when I had used for a while, and the government decided to beep my phone and send me a message, you know, like, you know, if you see a balloon full of shit that's come over the North Korean border, don't approach it. And could you call the police, please, and tell them where you are? Thank you very much. It was a wonderful little message. It was very funny. Anyway, that's all I have to add.
So a few things. First off, it does say a lot about the state of modern man where you need a message like that to go, oh, I'm so glad they told me. It would have never occurred. Oh gosh, if I see a balloon.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I love it on so many levels, because North Korea is like that petty, like, ex-girlfriend. Like, what sort of nation state is sending bags of shit over a national border? That is some like crazy ex-girlfriend stuff. Seriously, it's so funny.
I really hope that the maps in like South Korea, like literally they redo the maps and it's like ex-girlfriend over North Korea. It's like, oh yeah, don't go there. They're not going to give you any Olive Garden coupons over there. I think also too, like, yeah, the news is the best way to be uninformed. It's really not, like, what you're saying is that there are many things people can do that are removing, like separating. Like, why are you watching the news? I do the same thing. I'll use it for the pulse. I will use it to get a sense of things. But like, I just know of so many elderly people who basically have it on like a freaking fireplace. Like, it's on all day, and it's just there. And why not get a fireplace? Like, the fireplaces are pretty cool. You know, I can think of or a fake fireplace, right? But it's just like that Cortese and Dimitri, it's good to see you, sir, and it's a pleasure. But it's like that sort of thing is like, you do have the power to go over to your TV and hit the off button, and it goes away. It just goes away. And so likewise, what you're saying with the cell phone, and it's just very interesting because there is something about the technology that trains you to believe you cannot do without it. Right? But this is all the virilio, the perpetual emergency, this sort of like fear, this sort of I'm missing outness, just like the stock market. Better invest before you don't. Like, there's this kind of FOMO that's part of it. And also, it's almost like you don't want to be seen as not in the in, right? Oh, you don't have the most up-to-date phone, you're not in the in crowd, right? Which is very interesting because then there's like two levels to the feeling of disablement, as Ivan Illich would say, or there's nothing we can do. Like, that's how people talk. It's like, there's nothing we can do. We have to spend $1,000 to update our iPhone. Really? And then like you get it and then bookies.com, there's nothing we can do. There's this interesting way where technology makes you subconsciously really feel like there's nothing we can do. And yet at the same time, it's completely powerless. You can hit the button. You cannot buy it. It can't make you buy it. They can't make you watch the news. And that's what's fascinating, because we were talking a few weeks ago about how this idea with privations, evil, dare we say, where there's this way where there's no power, it's completely powerless, and yet at the same time, it feels unstoppable. Like, there's this notion that politicians are terrible, they're like, they're not very, and yet politics is unstoppable, right? Like there's these systems where the individual members of the system can feel powerless, like they can't do much. They're not shining, radiant individuals of a kind of overmen, but then the collective structure feels unstoppable. And politics makes me think of that. And it's interesting how technology has this similar sort of thing, right? It can't make you use it, and yet it feels like it's completely all powerful, right? It just makes me think of these bureaucratic structures where every member of the professional managerial class has a certain like smallness to them, and like a Kafka story, and yet all together it feels unstoppable, right? Likewise, the TV, you literally could turn it off, and yet it feels like unstoppable as a media apparatus. It's a really interesting dynamic of privations for me. And yeah, airports are something. I'm glad that you're detoxing airports, Mr. Barnes. I know that's been a process. Makes me think of the Clooney movie. Actually, it's really fun to think Up in the Air with Fiddler on the Roof and Midsummer, to talk about those three movies as actually speaking to like a new kind of Brothers Karamazov with the three brothers in Second Thoughts. So let me give it to Mr. Jockin. Mr. Jockin.
It's funny because so there's no, I mean, one note is I'm kind of sitting on this point, the learned helplessness, future decided by one does under pressure. It's almost like these are all examples of, actually it relates to the introduction problem. I think one important aspect of it is the problem of dimension reduction. What I mean by that is I was mentoring a pupil in my Plato class, and he was asking for like, basically was asking, can you give me a schema? Can you give me a diagram that presents the claim? And I said, in one sense I can, sure, but we're going to have to talk through it. It can be a useful guide, but I said it, and I said the issue is that these concepts of anageia, dumasis, phusis, and economai, like all these concepts and terms. So this is the idea of getting someone onboarded to be able to contribute effectively in a network effect. They have to get onboarded, to use that kind of language. And the problem is it's very easy to optimize it by a dimension reduction. What that means is like that term anageia and dumasis, for example, or all those categories, I can map onto a bunch of different terms, how they relate to each other, form to matter, for example. It's a lot easier to just reduce the complexity to say actuality and potential, matter, form, and like not point out that they are connected, that they are part of a higher dimensionality of relationships. I say that because yeah, Luber stepped out for a second, but this question of children, like I actually want to pause and challenge that a little bit to say you actually are like even the same. He's running back. Yeah, good to see you. Okay, when you're introducing terms to children, are there different dynamics, like different phenomena, but the same words being presented? That is an example of like you're showing that term is getting used in multiple dimensions. That's part of natural language learning, right? Is that when you're a natural learner, you figure out these rules, this schema, but it's not a lot of native speakers can't give you the reason. They can't give you a full schematic. Only someone, like they usually can't. Well, they would only be able to do it like really thinking about it. Versus what happened was when they were first experiencing that word being used in multiple domains and contexts, they were absorbing over time, which again takes time. Like that's the key, right? That natural English learners, like if you're a child, there's a time duration period. So there actually is exactly this introduction. You can call it the onboarding problem, the introduction problem. It's the same phenomenon, but at play is the tension of optimization by dimension reduction. That because reality has such huge diversity of dimensions, but our poor little brains can't process that. We can't even visualize it. The best we can do is 3 dimensions at best, maybe 4, but it gets really messy very quickly. It's a lot easier to optimize by just reduction. And all that, what that does is this is actually the argument to present why lacs appear as nothing is because of a dimension reduction. Those other possibility domains get shut down and compressed into nothing, into 0. And if you put it on a one-dimensional map, for example, 3 dimensions to 1, as an example. So I think that's kind of, I'm kind of chewing on this because I'm seeing that that's kind of what's going on here in play, right? Is that, listen, world's complicated, a lot of messiness involved. Businesses got to operate, they got to survive. Daniel, I do appreciate your point, by the way, of the like, if you're a small business and you're in hospitality, you will be obliterated by reviews. Like your mechanisms of feedback are very different now, aren't they? Usually that's one of the dynamics here, is that the feedback mechanism has been removed or obfuscated in multiple ways. But I think another part is this idea, like what are you optimizing for, right? And by that optimization, there's a dimension reduction. And if it gets too aggressively done, what's going to end up happening is that there's going to be potential, like you're going to optimize for what you want, what you get, basically idea of like algorithms optimizing for base desires versus higher ends. Like that's just how it's going to go. Or in the case of education, like that's kind of circle back on that point to close off. The issue is exactly it. It's like there's a presumption that basically, as we said on the fireplace of your course, I just concluded, which was great, by the way. Everyone should do the next course they take. You definitely jump on it for OG Rose. We talked about this in the fire pit session about it, where there's a problem of presumption that the bachelor's is 4 years of introductions. And even that, and that's the thing is like in the past, in many disciplines, you were actually pretty like you could start contributing information, like real insight, having network effects at the end of your bachelor's going into your master's. Now it's a presumption. It's still, you're playing baby stuff. It's baby's first concept. It's all the way to the, like you're still in the master's at this framework now in most disciplines, just getting onboarded, getting introduced to the concepts, to the account, your logos of the discipline. And it's only the network effects are supposed to happen in the PhD. Now, that's basically what's happened. So now we've like extended in time and extreme inefficiency. But that's the tension we talked about in the fireplace, is that there's that tension where like by the optimizations and priorities of the school systems, we've extended the introduction time phasing, but yet also students know we can go on YouTube and get this shit pretty quick, right? Now, those are like dimension reductions, granted, but that's the point, is that like if this is supposed to get onboarded to get the concepts, you can get it from there in much faster, much quicker time. Just for the fact that you can just put that stuff on 2x speed and just go through a 3-hour lecture in an hour and a half by 2x speed, for example. Requires some intention on your part, but it can be done. So I'm just chewing on that because there's a little bit of a tension part about this, because it's almost like, and it's not just like the arts. Like the arts would be normally where this would come up, right? Where it's like, I can give you the account of like, what do we look for? How do we evaluate artwork, for example? And I give you a bunch of concepts, but then how they apply to actual evaluation of art that is actually very multi-diverse, and it has multiple things that like you would pull out certain dimensions more than others, weighing of things. That's also a big thing. It's like actually the idea of like, there's not just the nodes, like getting the basic nodes, distinctly objects. You guys see how the concepts connect, and then how they weigh, how they distribute in the network. That's what actually the real difficulty is it's not even the nodes of getting the terms, not even the connection of the nodes, right? It's the next level, which is the distribution of those nodes and connections. They're not equally distributed. They're not even close. There might be one weighing heavier on one side than the other. So that's actually the real difficulty. So I just want to point that out, is that's the problem we're facing here. I do think it's possible, but usually the answer has been just run the clock harder, just run this harder, and just give people exposure longer, and you'll get it. So I'll close with that.
No, all outstanding. And this was the graph you showed, right? The smiley face, you'd be like, just that, and you'll get beauty. It'll be fine, right? Because that's what I showed them. I walked up to the desk and put this on and said, hi, I'm gonna need that Olive Garden coupon at the hotel. Yeah, no, literally, I was like, Robert, lack is not nothing. We need the coupon. And for some reason, it didn't click. I don't know why. There's a lot there that you said that's very good. So to basically have the introduction problem be something that you have to get a PhD to address in an ever complex and globalized world is a really big problem. Because it would also suggest that and also, of course, by definition, the people that get a PhD generally are going to be a limited number of people, right? So in a world of ever complexity, the amount of people that have reached the network level, if you will, is going to be very limited. And that seems like a mismatch, because you're going to have a lot of people that are going to feel as if the system is not making space for them because it's not. They're going to feel as if the education is not getting them to where they need to be because it's not. And then they're in debt. And that's probably going to lead to social unrest and all sorts of problems, right? So this issue of the introduction problem is quite severe. And rather than deal with this is my point, rather than deal with the introduction problem and figure out how to deal with, meeting people face to face and overcoming introductions and bringing in the human element, we're just saying, you got to go to bookings.com. You got to get a PhD. It's all an outsourcing away from introduction, because something about introduction is always human. There's always a certain face. Please, Mr. Jockin.
There's one thing I want to add too. And by the way, you know what's funny? I've been meaning to bring this up to you. I was talking to a friend of mine because you've been on about the issue of accreditation. You know what's really interesting? I got curious about this. I looked it up. I looked at the accreditation of my alma mater, right? Do you know actually what the fee is to actually get it? To actually get the accreditation? It takes 3 years. It's $12,000. That's the fee. That's not like, I went in there assuming, wow, no, because of the scale order, I'm thinking it had to be hundreds of thousands, like some crazy amount of money of fees to get the accreditation. Remember, and that accreditation is what the mechanism is to get you you can take loans, for example. Your degree has weight in the infrastructural bureaucracies of, I apply for this program, they need to look up that my degree's legit. Like, I'm just saying, like, that's the actual, like, when you realize the emperor has no clothes. See, I just want to bring this up to you, is that these accreditation bodies, it's not even a cost. It's not even a cost of barrier of entry. That's a very minimal capital requirement. Like, if it was 100,000, $500,000, and they had to pay that regularly to keep the accreditation, I think these would be strong critiques to say, this is unreasonable. This is literally stopping like anyone to actually even address these problems. I'm sorry, I apologize for bringing that up, because that's an emperor has no clothes moment for me, because I'm like, oh, fuck this. We could totally do it. Like, it doesn't, if that's the case, then that's just an issue of just some startup capital, not even that much, especially because in the past, by the way, I think a more reasonable blockage from more schools actually being accredited was they had resource requirements. Certain square footage, certain access to materials and computers. But guess what happened with COVID? It broke, all those rules got tossed out the window, basically. So now no longer is the resource problem anymore. So I just want to give a note. Now, it is in my field, so I just want to point that out. I'm sure in other fields, their accreditation bodies might be different. So I can only qualify what I looked into in my discipline, in my area. But I looked at it and I was like, okay, wait a minute. It really is like, it's actually like that learned helplessness and that perception that this mammoth bureaucracy or institution is so big and we have no power, but no one actually bothered to actually look at the documents. Go look at the actual requirements and what's actually expected of them to actually start a school and get the accreditation and to be able to be a degree granting entity. It's nothing. It's literally dust. It's the biggest problem is just getting started, is that you have to go 3 years, basically. It's a 3-year get started issue, where for the first 3 years, you're going to basically ask those first three generation of pupils to do this without a degree, that they're going to have to go and taking the risk of doing a program and completing it without the accreditation power behind it. That's probably in my mind, the bigger risk. That's the only limitation, is that problem, as opposed to a capital problem or any other kind of material resource problem to start a school. But I just want to throw that back in there, as I forgot to bring that up.
It is completely possible that the liminal web would actually help deal with the problem of the first 3 years if you were to actually fund, start a business, be an accredited form. Like, you've actually also got some of the networking, some of the sort of building of that portfolio in play. But it's a very important point. I think basically for most people, it's like, well, I'm not going to pay for the accreditation because I don't have the building, I don't have the space, I don't have the land, I don't have the teachers and different things. Well, more and more you're seeing the liminal web might be addressing that organically, right? And so there are possibilities there that I think are of extreme note. I think also that is speaking to, well, like you say, I think also there's a notion of imposter syndrome that also works in its favor, because who am I to be accredited? Who am I to do this? But that, I meant to mention this earlier, one of the things that bookings.com and all of them use to their benefit is precisely the idea of you feel bad to say anything. Oh, I should just be happy. I'll just accept it. They use that, and they hope you give up. They hope you stop trying to reach them. And then you also feel bad for even wanting to be refunded or to receive something, even though you were basically tricked, right? They use that against you. So likewise, imposter syndrome, also saying, well, who's going to care about my accreditation? It doesn't have the authority of a Harvard or anything like that, right? Like, there's all of those kind of notions that contribute to stopping the creation of these opportunities. I don't know what the accreditation costs are for something like a philosophy school or a humanities school or different things like that. But the part that you're bringing up is extremely important. I think also too, like you say, I think the confidence of people to do that as the liminal web develops will grow. And as you get more and more of that portfolio, there will be possibilities there. But I think it's a brilliant point. And I think also too, for me, what you're saying with colleges as an extended introduction matter, that would be great when we'll have tea at 4 or something. That's the time where tea is, right? Like at 4 or something like that. The problem is, what does everybody say about colleges? Where do you get most of the education from? Outside the classroom, right? So where do you get what's the point of going to these academic conferences? The bars to meet people, right? Okay, so what if you still had colleges, you just kind of removed all of the introduction crap and just had it focus on the network effects, or had it focus on groups of people gathering to talk about Heidegger or beauty or the arts or different things? I do wonder if there's something to be said where it's a larger topic, where colleges actually could function more communally, almost like YMCAs, to gather people who autodidactically or through alternative means have gone through introduction problems. So they become concentrated areas for very effective networking and also communal activity. Because right now, like a lot of people feel like these colleges are almost like parasitical, like they're almost like bad for their towns. They're there. You always have the competition between the college and the townies, or at least in a lot of American places, there's this feeling of, but then at the same time, the towns are like, yeah, but without the colleges, we'd be doomed, right? They bring in so much economic activity, but there's this feeling of this wall between the community and the colleges. I do wonder if indeed there is opportunity for colleges to more so actually embrace being a place of efficient networking without being elongated introduction problem solvers, if you will, because you have the technology now, like you say, to introduce on your own, to kind of work up to speed, right? Otherwise, it seems like the introduction problem just gets elongated forever. You just kind of push it off. It just goes on and on forever, because theoretically, you could always do a one-time speed video, like you could do that for 30 years, right? In-person meeting and so on. So there's no necessary limit to how much the introduction problem could be extended to the benefit of the revenues of colleges and different things, right? But so that problem but there could be a certain saturation point where it feels so overextended that eventually people say, this is silly because I can learn it on YouTube. And at that point, colleges will either have to buckle down and become more forceful about the introduction services they provide, or innovate and actually say, everyone always says that what you benefit the most is from, what happens outside the classroom, or in the more, dare I say, advanced classrooms where everyone is talking about their PhD thesis or own work and they're going from there. Well, why don't we just double down on that? Why don't we really focus on doing that kind of thing? And I think that there's some innovation there that is very possible if colleges were to become, yeah, that's right, Mr. Wynn, where if colleges were to think of themselves more of communal centers that have particular resources that people could be gathered at. Like I think of a Type Tuesday happening at it, like a university. I think of net conversation. I think of like you could have jazz improvisation. These things could happen, and you're just removing the inefficiency from them. Which could have various effects that could be beneficial. I like the phrase onboarding. I think that's very good. I mean, basically what I'm saying is I feel like colleges are kind of like in the middle. That's the problem. There's kind of a mediocrity. Like you go because of the networking effect outside of it, but then there's also inefficient addressing of the introduction problem. So it's kind of like in the middle. It does this mediocre thing, which, if there were ways to just kind of buckle down on what it shines at, which is the networking effect, and basically put it on people who are coming into the space to deal with the introduction problem on their own time and their own abilities and resources. That also might work for colleges not being a bubble so much, because you would have people like actually more so exposed on the outside, working on their own autodidactically to figure out the introduction problem and bringing it into the college. I'd have to think about that, but that could also be something to consider. And I'm going to pass it to Mr. Luber. Mr. Luber, please.
Two things come to my mind. The first is it's almost as if, I don't know if you guys saw the movie The Game. It's an older movie. The guy who played Gordon Gekko plays it. I forget his name. I'm shitty with names. Basically, everything in his world, once he started the game, everything in his world, even the things you wouldn't expect, were all part of the game. So it seems like the move for colleges is to create a game where once you're in college, everything in your world that you would have to experience would be part of the college's game. That's a pretty daunting task in my mind. The reason why I'm thinking that would be the case is because the outside of school would have to be part of the school, but like without it being like explicitly on the surface that this is part of school. So it would have to be part of the game, essentially. The other thing is more of a question, I guess, about these communal, like, networking classes. That's the problem that I see with that is, and this, I forget which net, and I remember Jockin was on the net, and it was like people just want to be numbed. I forget that they just don't even want to deal. It was some sentiment like that. I forget the particulars. Maybe you guys who are smarter than me will remember. But basically, I don't even think people would go to class because they don't know what they're looking for. So, like, let me give an example. I go on the net not because I have some preordained, I'm gonna get X and Y, but that's how people think. They say to themselves, okay, yeah, I'm gonna go to the bar so I can get a girl. I'm not going out unless there's an opportunity. Like, it's like a very correspondence one-for-one thing. Like, I do this for that. I think you have to cultivate the ability to go into a situation not having that. So part of the introduction problem here is, how do you have a class where it can't be assumed that everyone has gathered that type of orientation? And it's not an easy orientation. I would say I'm definitely sometimes that guy that's like, I'm not going out unless it's this, you know? So I don't even think I have got to the point. I think I'm very particular in, my openness into a situation. And like in reflecting about how I'm in certain situations open into entering them, am I able to get this thought? I don't think I embody what I'm saying at all. I think, if it wasn't a philosophy, if, people weren't philosophy creatives, researchers, kind of what Wynn was saying in the chat, would I be here right now? I don't know. I think, I've developed personal relations, but like beyond that, what actually got me here in the first place was me doing research on my book, finding Daniel. Like, it was purely in that world, like from the very beginning. So I think that's like, if the class didn't have participants that were like that, I don't know if I would go to class. I think I would be a delinquent, essentially. And I think a lot of people would be delinquents. I think, certain people will still do that, like, one for one. I'm going to go to this networking class because I know these people are like this, which is still kind of going out for getting the girl. I'm only going to go to the bar if I get a girl, kind of thing, if there's a girl around. It's the same sentiment. So I'm curious what your response is to that. I agree, and let me just say, I agree with the trajectory in which, the telos of this path that you're outlining. When I'm thinking about it, this is just something that comes to my mind that's like, okay, this needs to be addressed. But yeah, I'll pass it off.
No, it's an excellent point. I mean, there's a few things where one of the reasons you have an introduction problem where you basically funnel everyone into school or higher education. One of the reasons, I mean, we can go through all the different educational philosophies, is basically the notion of people don't know what they want or they're interested in. So there's this wide exposure. You have to, expose them to a lot as a generalist, and then you're going to see and different things, right? And then if something catches fire, then they know what they're going to major in or blah, 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 right? And then, of course, there's a lot of people now where there's always this kind of idea, there's inefficiencies of that because maybe too many people are going to college. Now it's still a minority of people that go to college, but there's still all of these kind of questions that are going through, right? Well, the notion of with the liminal web or the YouTube or all these different spaces, if the technology was used right, instead of avoiding responsibility and not letting Daniel and Michelle get their Olive Garden coupon, if instead it was used to extend humanity, where people could see, oh, these are the people there. Oh, this is what they're interested in. And they can do their own introduction to find their own project, then that would actually help solve this introduction problem to help people find things, help them find what they're interested in, 2, find other people interested in that, 3, get a sense of who those people are and what they're interested in versus like 2 years of awkward small talk or something like that. And then 4, could work right into the network effect that can arise when you get people who have done all of that groundwork to till the soil, right? So you still have to deal with that. But could YouTube make it clearer that there was a girl at the bar versus go to the bar and find out there wasn't one, right? That's sad. If you could use YouTube to find out that thing is there, or that, oh, I'm actually into, the girl at the bar that likes Heidegger, and it looks like that girl is into Heidegger and they're at that university, right? So then you go there, right? Because you have a more efficient transparency structure, right? Also, too, there's questions of if the liminal web, this is where we talk so much about the intrinsic motivation, because basically the prerequisite for network effects seems tied to intrinsic motivation, where each node of the network has an intrinsic motivation that has brought them to that place, right? So what are the conditions that increase the probability that people are intrinsically motivated? Has stuff to do with being exposed, of seeing, a portfolio versus resume, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So those are also infrastructural questions that one asks if the liminal web can do. But it's a wonderful question, and et cetera. Mr. Luber.
Sorry, you're okay. This is very interesting because this comes down to, and we've talked about this as well, attraction, essentially. But the way you're talking about it, for some reason, gravity is coming up in my mind, where it's almost as if, and this is like a scary, slippery slope here, but it's almost as if there's a certain meta awareness that there's a certain awareness of the meta dash whatever, that's a interchangeable variable x, meta dash x. It seems as if it's almost like a mathematical physics equation where it's like it understands that, because I didn't choose in a certain, I did choose to love philosophy, it is a choice, but what made me compelled wasn't a choice. What made me compelled to choose wasn't a choice. So it's almost, it seems like we become so aware of that which compels, and the language game, if you will, that's associated with that which compels, the dash sentiment that I was saying earlier, the question of beauty in my mind, that it's almost as if it's now physics. It's almost like, okay, we're so aware of the temporal aspect that we can sublate that into just a physical algebraic equation almost. And that scares me, because then people will just be tribal. That's a potential path, is just tribalism. It seems very fixed and rigid, which just leads to a lot of bad things. But yes, please.
No, to the point, there is a certain architect, a certain formulation where you're talking about increased probabilities. It's not like a one-to-one, if we put these variables together, you get something together. It's probability theory. You're talking about if you have certain exposures, certain conditions that increase the probability that people find their intrinsic motivation, and then they're able to deal with the introduction problem, and then they have extra avenues, there's a certain probability. of the effectiveness of the network that could occur. And let's say there's an increase from 4% to say 18% of people who are intrinsically motivated as such, that may deal with the solar residual in economics. That is this 20 to 50% of productivity that cannot be explained by fluctuations in labor or credit markets. So there is a certain kind of structure to it, but here's the key. The key to the only way you keep meta awareness from not turning into something self-effacing is via relationship. Because relationship always keeps the meta from, like, the relationship is the space of self-forgetfulness that also has you re-enter into the dialogos, if you will, or otherness. Because if you have meta-awareness, but it's meta-awareness of a condition that entails variables that you can never entirely access, the other, then the meta-awareness cannot lead to an entire collapse of the variable. So you have to bring into the relationship. And that's also because there's always a tension between meta and mystery. Like, very often we confuse meta and mystery, where we think just because we have a meta-awareness, therefore it's aware, because it has this eternal regression effect that feels like a mystery. But meta is the counterfeit of mystery as such. Meta is a counterfeit of beauty as well, right? Like, there's a certain ever deepening that the meta brings with it, but it's kind of the privation of beauty, if you will, and lack, right? It's like ever meta, like the, you know, postmodern meta fiction. You can always have a self-reference on a self-reference on a self-reference. That is the illusion of a relationship. Actually, you're just changing perspectives of an entrapped ego. So it is not mystery, but it creates the effect of mystery because there's this ever movement that is part of it, right? So the moment you bring in a meta awareness, you're at risk of having the counterfeit of the meta replace the mystery, which then leads to auto-cannibalism, as we've described before. The only way to enter an age of meta-awareness, as we basically must now with the internet, global pluralism, and all of these other things. Also, meta-awareness seems to be a necessary tool in order to rightly situate yourself in the conditionalism by which beauty can be experienced. So you need meta-awareness to rightly condition yourself. But that very tool of meta-awareness runs the risk of you losing the mystery. If you can use the meta-awareness to situate yourself in relationship, that is a variable that is inaccessible to the meta, that puts limits onto how much the meta can deconstruct. And so meta-awareness in relation with beauty then helps keep the meta from turning into an eternal regression. Mr. Luber.
Okay, that was great. So here, I agree with all that. I see a possibility in which, and again, I'm coming from it from like storytelling and just associating this with theme. So you can have a certain, the meta can have a certain relationship to the mystery. From a bird's eye view, it seems infinite.
Yes.
From a phenomenological view, if it's not trained in the bird's eye view, what will happen is that you will have a fixed relation between the mystery and the meta.
Mm-hmm.
And it won't get a sense. The mystery is still a mystery only within how it's a fixed relationship to that particular meta. So what could happen is effacement on that front, where it's fixed within a particular way of relating. And that's the fear. Like I could see a very smart person listening to this, coming up with some design, math, invention, whatever. And it's like, oh, it's coming from this beautiful idea, so classic, you know? It's like I'm inventing something I was inspired by these philosophers and thinkers or whatever. And then the byproduct of that is actually kind of doing the opposite of what the inspiration was telling him to do. And I can see that being what happens literally, where it's like, yeah, okay, we're becoming more aware of all these things and these relations, and we can now like translate that mathematically in computer science and whatnot. And the byproduct is now it's a fixed relationship between, like, it's obfuscating really what that relationship is.
Is this the part where we transition to theology because you can never escape it at the end of the day? Comes back to the God variable. So, you know, if there's not something that is the source of the mystery outside of the human element that is ultimately transcended, you could theoretically always create these sort of structures, right? Fun, right? Final absolute choice. But as a closing point, precisely this is where the meta has a necessary role, in that it helps you from the fixedness, because the meta allows you to move back to the bird's eye, then have a new relation, and when it becomes fixed, you jump to the meta. So this is where, Last week, we were saying there has been moral evolutions that we want to keep, but we haven't been able to replace with a doctrine of substance, if you will, to know what, say, marriage is about, childbearing. Therefore, we have all these pathologies. We've lost belonging because of a moral advancement, but we don't know how to belong again. Likewise, we have gaining the meta-awareness is an intellectual advancement. The problem is that without mystery, beauty, a doctrine of substance, the meta just becomes the ever meta feeding on itself. But it is an advancement where it can help you avoid the fixedness problem, right? But even that could theoretically arrive at the schema you were describing if we don't in different things.
So sorry, real quick, and then I'll shut up. But basically, like Carl Jung to me is a perfect example. He's inspired by all these great thinkers, and he came up with these archetypes. These archetypes to me is a not personification. It embodies a fixed relationship to the mystery. And that's why I don't even agree. Like, it helps you think the relation, but it ultimately fails in what you need to be doing and thinking through the relation. And like, that's why I'm like, for like storytelling, like, I just don't see there being, oh, this is a hero's journey. Oh, this is it's way more complex than that. And like, yeah, I mean, the book, but yeah.
But that's what Philip Reeve, that's 100% what Philip Reeve said about what his problems were with Jung in favor of Freud. But then he looked at Freud and said, but Freud, buddy, Jung was looking at you and saying, okay, Freud, you set him free. People are free with your psychoanalysis, but what are they free to do? And Freud was like, well, that's not our problem. And Jung's like, well, let's see where that gets you. But then the problem is, I do agree with the archetypical, like what Reeve said is that meant everyone would have their own private religion. And he was basically saying religion is supposed to be communal. But then to Philip, again, but Philip Reeve is like, I have no idea what to do about that, and died. So, that can get you out of the problem. If you die, then you're not responsible for the address. It's absolutely this problem. And so the archetypes, it's kind of like, too, most people use Myers-Briggs to figure out who they are. Myers-Briggs could be useful to realize that people have different language games that you need to adapt to, not to identify with yourself as a private language, but it's just too difficult not to, right? Archetypes could be useful to know that people truly are different and to think that, but it instead becomes private religions that leads to atomization. So the meta, exactly, and I'll give it to Jockin here and then Mr. Wynn, meta is an advancement if it is used to help you avoid the fixedness. But with the meta and the avoidance of fixedness, if it doesn't ultimately come back to a mystery, then it leads into lots of trouble. And I agree with that. But let me give it to Mr. Jockin. Mr. Jockin.
I mean, I think that's fine. This is the ladder of love. I'm Dall-E. This is all being discussed here. I'm just on that because, by the way, one note on that. Anyways, you guys know the YouTube channel More Plates, More Dates. I don't know if you guys know about that. Okay, the shtick of that is basically it's a guy, basically, he appears like he's incredibly knowledgeable about pharmaceuticals, basically biochemistry related to performance enhancement for bodybuilding. And that was the original motivation of his channel, was basically guys want to get fit, to get laid. Let's go over how to do that properly, shall we, to get those results. Now, and then basically his content was basically discussions of like things related around that, like people doing wild mistreatments and horrible side effects from that. And him commenting how bad or dumb those decisions were, with very much awareness of like the pharmaceutical properties of it and how it works. I listened to an interview with him recently, and everyone presumed this man must have he must have went to school for biochem, some variation. He said, no, actually I didn't. I did business, but I got really interested on the topic and I did my own personal research. And then there you go. Like, it's the, that's really interesting because I actually remember one of my mentors made a mention to this. We were on a joint call with a potential collaborator at Harvard for research, and what she showed me afterwards, like what she did. She said, "Oh yeah, what I basically did, I made sure I used the right words. The use of words operated with this. He was an optometrist, so he was specifically talking on that area of domain expertise. She was using the terms that optometrists would know." So what it was doing was, by using that language, it was operating as an exemplar, as a certification of knowing what she's talking about. And I have to admit, I've done that too. I can usually we do use that. So I have mixed feelings about that. Just as a tangent note, I'm just kind of tangenting in this issue. I want to circle back to my original reason I'm bringing up the more place, more dates guy in a second. Obviously, the issue of the paper certification, right, that you got certified by this organization, we feel there's a problem with that. That seems like way too much of an abstraction and not too much on the particular. A slightly better mode that I still have very big suspicions about is that, oh, because you studied under this person or this person, you're now certified. That's slightly better because it's more personalized, but still, that doesn't necessarily mean you actually have knowledge or competent in the field. It just knows you were basically it's taking the scale down of who's referring you, who's qualifying you, and went from the organization to now individuals. Okay, slightly better, or at least seems good, better in one sense, but also seems again same issue of suspicion of like, really, we're going to use that as certification that you have knowledge? That's a little odd. Next level is what happened there, which was by use of language in discourse, you demonstrated expertise. Right, that seems better, and it actually causes very interesting dynamics where certain people were literally like, "Oh, we trust you," like because of that, like because you use that language in that way, you have knowledge. That's really interesting because in Critilas, there's this whole problem of just because you know the names of things does not know the reality of things. Then just because you know the high and low note does not mean you know harmony. Just because you know the parts of the anatomy of the body does not mean you know what health is, as an example. So this is all parts of, you can have the nodes, you can even know the connection of the edges of the nodes in the network, but you have to know distribution, which of those nodes together. So anyways, I'm just drawing through a kind of a problem or just thinking through that a little bit. I find that very interesting. I don't have an answer about that. It seems to be basically at this point how we verify people in terms of we look at people because the example, Daniel, in the question of the YouTube, right? Like this massive exposure of content, basically by people giving their accounts, we see by repetition exposure of it, not only where they're coming from, what they're about, but we're making assessments how much knowledge they have by their ability to give an account. I feel like that's the danger is potential. I feel like there's still a risk of danger. I'm chewing on that part because then it only seems the only way that's possible through, actually, I'm going to go from features on this. It has to be live speech. It can't be a pre-recorded message. It has to be the direct interaction or on the fly, you're using your account to address a phenomenon or situation where it then draws out. Actually, that usually is probably the best level of expertise is that in the exact account, like here's an example. In my domain, I'm seeing work to put on the wall. The fact that I have no prep time, no nothing. I literally show up to a classroom and go, all right, put the work up. And I have no preparation. And then I'm ripping off a mode of discourse with them and a method of investigation with them. And then doing the dialogos of interaction, of interpersonality, of intersubjectivity, of their response to the work, then playing off the room, their response to the work, then counteracting that against their intention and against the discourse of the discipline historically, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Like kind of like boom, this explosion of information shows up. But that's only possible in the live discourse. So I think about that. Also, because even in the course I'm doing right now, that's exactly what I'm doing. What I do with them is I put in front of them a question. So they're given a prompt that I purposely made obfuscatable, meaning it's like very complex. It's a very big, not just nodes, but then how the nodes connect in edges and distribute. They're super high dimensional. I did it on purpose, where I put them in the groups. The pupils went, we have no idea. I'm like, good. Tell me why you got tripped up. Then they told me where you got tripped up. I let the group basically then people first talk with them. I let the group speak with themselves first. I didn't jump in to try to address. And then after I saw some areas that were not overlapping or not connecting, I addressed on the fly. Again, my knowledge is I can only show expertise by demonstrating that on the fly to these particular pupils, they had this sticking point to a dimensional map of concepts and logos and account that I knew they couldn't get, which I purposely did on purpose to draw out their conflict and then addressed it. Right. So I'm just chewing through. I just worked through at least I think I worked through talking out loud what it seems to be a way to address liminal kind of knowledge acquisition and demonstration of expertise in the web. That's not a credentialism kind of mode. Okay, the other note, and then back to the more place, more dates is this is an orientation of the ladder of love. And in terms of moving your base desires, right, the lower level stuff, and Daniel, on your point of meta thinking, is the idea of abstraction. That's the whole point. the idea that meta thinking, one of the properties of it is just the ability to observe multiple phenomenon or related by a common topic or a common reality. That's a mode of meta thinking. If we didn't have that, we would never have knowledge, because we would just have sensational experiences and no account to understand that they map off similarity, that in similarity there's difference. Anyways, and then moving to higher and higher levels of first bodily pleasures and bodily sensations, then to more constant, more abstraction, and eventually getting to the level of basically things like law, right? Principles, wisdom, things like that, kind of moving up the chain of orientation. So I said that was my attempt to kind of circle back on that side, right? And then actually leads to a question that's discussed in Meno, and it's a big topic in Plato and in Aristotle is, can you teach virtue? Like, the question here is not just teaching of technes, right? Because that's also, again, the question of optimization, is flattening dimensionality of the beautiful into the goods, which is a big tension. Is that basically ultimately it's come down to the question of what can education give me against my risk of taking it, and I need an outcome. I need a deliverable outcome which can be quantified and give me money. So whatever this new discussion of education is going to be, we're going to have to address that. Again, the beautiful always has to entail the good. You can't just have it for its. That's always actually a great mistake. As Daniel, as we said, like when we realized that a social imagination was actually how value actually gets generated, which money is just a capture of and a dimension reduction of. When we realized that, then actually the kalos of what was supposed to be our training was supposed to generate that. It's very fascinating when we think about it that way. There has to be basically generation of mass value. Like there has to be massive outpouring of generational demand, right? Not just stimulation, but actual generation of it. Like kind of draw out your distinction, Daniel. Otherwise, these things would not go off the ground, because people. That's the point. People only listen to you first when you get them results, which was part of the problem when basically nominalist accounts or other accounts that shut down, that were physicalist, got results. That's why they were listened to. Let's be honest here. That's why, because they got results. So as a result, if it's useful and we can get the results we want, then who gives a shit that there's huge contradictions in these accounts that don't work when we actually push them harder? Who cares? Because we get the short-term result we want. And some of those are perfectly reasonable. You know, if physics account is going to save your parents from dying from some disease, you're going to shut up and listen to it. Again, listen, how many of you are going to really take the prayer over medicine coming in and saving? It's a big question. It's a huge question mark. So I'm just saying, like, this tension here that's what we're talking about here, is that there is a reduction of dimensionality because it solved problems, which got us to goods. But then we realized when we worked those through and we saw they had contradictions, because they were dimension reductions of the real reality. So error was added. And when we compound error over and over and over again, we're going to get massive. We're going to eventually go way off the target, missing the mark. Vice, that used to kind of play off the term from Aristotle. So I'm just kind of chewing on this, right? Because that's kind of like, that's some interesting dynamics getting played here. So I find it very interesting. So I want to put that back to the group, have their thoughts about this.
Outstanding. And I can't wait, like, with the guys at bookings.com and watch it, be like, this is a really effed up review video. Really, God, it's like, they're all sitting there, it's like, wow, this is a good review. We're going to put this on Yelp. It's going to go really well. First off, you said a bunch of things that are insanely important. I'll give it to Mr. Wynn. I think one of the reasons why a lot of places do these live question and answer videos is trying to show live speech. I think there is this effort. Basically, this is why improv, jazz, cipher mentality, all of this is huge, because the improvisational jazz is the ultimate certification, or it can be a form of a very powerful certification, because you can't fake the improv, especially if it's live. I guess you could do a deep fake video or something at this point, but there's something about the live improv that's insanely powerful in its certification potential. And it's also very interesting because generally, if you can do improv and not read music, people tend to be like more like, oh, okay, but that's okay because you taught yourself. Wow. But if you're like, can read music, but you can't do improv, it's interesting how that's almost, I think, often lesser. Now, unless you're a professional in the industry, but if the industry is corrupted, then it's actually often the improv that sort of captures things, right? Like, you're a professional orchestra, all of that depends on reading music. But it's interesting how let's put it this way. The new vanguard is often led by some sort of certification of improvisation, some sort of live speech, as you're putting it. I think it's a huge deal and very, very important. Also, too, the problem of teaching virtue and surprise spaces are always tied together. And the more and more meta-awareness grows or becomes more dynamic, the harder it is to teach virtue, because people are more aware of the ways to gain virtue, if you will. You made an excellent example of special language, right? Like if you hear someone using special terms, you go, oh, well, they must know what they're talking about, right? That worked for a long time, but now we're in an age with videos, ChatGPT, where you can gamify the speech. You can learn it quite easily. There was a long period of time where learning that speech and faking it was pretty difficult. And even if you could fake it, why would you fake it? Unless you were in the industry, right? Like, why would you fake it? You know, the incentives were simply not there. But now you do have incentives to fake the language, because building platforms and all the other things, impressing girls at the bar or something, there are all these kind of things there, right? So there's this way where the meta-awareness has developed where that method of certification is no longer available, right? So you can't say there's necessarily a virtue in learning that language. Whereas maybe in the past, it was more likely that virtue correspondence and learning the language were tied together, because the mechanisms of gamification were not there yet, because awareness via technology had not arisen to the place to figure out how to game it, right? So basically, the reason why it is so hard to teach virtue, or one of the reasons it is so difficult to teach virtue, is because you have to figure out how to create spaces of surprise. And meta-awareness, if we grant that term, is really, really good at figuring out how to remove all places of surprise and creating simulacra of surprise. So how do you generate genuine places of surprise and then have the certain guidance so when people go into that surprise, they're able to not be overwhelmed and destroyed by it, but actually rise to its occasion and cultivate virtue, right? And this is where also meta-awareness, wherever there's surprise, there's mystery, right? Like, and lack, right? Like what you did in your classroom, where you're like, you have no idea what's there. What did you do? You made lack is not nothing. I know you don't. You have forced them into a lack situation. You're looking at this. You have no idea what you said. Good. Now we can create virtue, because you have situated them in lack, per se, right? You have situated them in lack. So what we have to do to train virtue is situate people in lack, but that is really freaking hard, because you have to be ahead of meta-awareness. You always have to be ahead of meta-awareness, of learning how to gamify, which maybe under the age of AI, you're kind of at the ultimate saturation of that. We've talked about it with the Calzer, the absolute history, the true history, with Luber and Alex's book, on the idea now you actually have to become ultra intention, where the only vanguard is surprise, like really, really intentional surprise. Like, because that's the only vanguard in lived experience. Even if the AI could create surprise, the experience of surprise could never be taken from you by the AI. Like the experience of surprise and the seeing how you rise to its occasion, that is something that AI by definition could not do unless it wasn't surprise, right? Now, maybe there's a possibility where AI could remove all possible spaces of surprise in all possible ways. If that was the case, then virtue would seemingly be impossible at that point. But it does not seem possible to remove all possible places of surprise, because surprise is always lived ultimately. Like, sure, AI could create the violin MP3, but it couldn't. Your surprise and ability to answer the improv could not be replaced. Mr. Jockin.
Well, just to add on that, actually, to circle back to the beginning with your whole bookings.com saga, the issue is because by dimension reduction of abstraction, error is introduced into reality. And that's fine, because that's the point. Is like it's good enough, right? So it gets the job done. But then over time, as the accumulation of error builds up, eventually the error will have a strike of reality. Yes. A rupture of reality will reveal itself, aka there's a surprise, aka crowd strike, aka whatever. Like, take your pick. So just to add, I'll just intervene on that point. Actually, I made that argument by the nature of dimension reduction. By that mechanism, error must be included by necessity into that. As a result, errors in there. And then over time, it's guaranteed eventually a rupture of failure, surprise, will happen.
That's 100%. And therefore, the great human asset is error and imperfection. Like, we're always like, did God make the best of all possible worlds? Well, there's a way in which by having error be part of the best of all possible, error is the last guard against AI. There's
No, I'm sorry. Actually, Thomas Aquinas is a huge point about this. He says like basically the perfection in the universe is in it's basically that fact that there's privation, that there's lack in existence.
Yep.
Meaning that because there's a hierarchy of participation in being, this is actually part of God's wisdom in the sense that this gives the completion of the universe is in the lacking state of it and different degrees of it.
Oh yeah, because it puts a limit on what AI can do but there is always a space where humanity cannot be replaced. The error that AI could never entirely get rid of sets a limit on that protects humanity. It's almost like the Kant, Kant was all about the noumenon protecting us, and it blew up in his face, in my opinion. But but he's, but anyway, it's like, nah, error. It's freaking error that actually sets a limit. And thus there is always a space for virtue. Because virtue is the shepherding of that error, if you will, the managing of that error. It's like if reality was not imperfect, then AI could erase humanity, basically, right? Because it is imperfect, there is theoretically the possibility of the space of the human always and already. The variable of addressing that error is virtue, which in addressing is the experience of the strike of beauty. And the best of all possible worlds would be one of that structure. If the humans are going to be in it, would I think be the Aquinas strike there. But that's like Cadell and I were saying, like basically the problem of the future is not all the stuff AI is going to do. It's all the stuff AI is not going to do that we're not going to know it's not going to do, and thus is going to surprise us, right? And that's going to require the cultivation of virtue in different things. But let me pass it to the beautiful, the one and only Thomas Wynn. Mr. Thomas Wynn, it's good to see you.
It's good to be here. It's been a month. I'm very happy. It's been a nice time listening for 2 hours. And all I wanted to really say when I put the hand up was something that I've now forgotten, because the point, I think basically what I can talk about now based upon like the last 5-10 minutes is I'm reading this book now by Rainer Sherman called Broken Hegemonies. And it's basically introducing in his general introduction the same point about this idea of this additional aspect to technical knowledge. So like what were we talking, like Jockin was talking about, and teaching and like going on the fly, like somehow that does something quite unique when you teach, even just purely information or history or any form of knowledge. Because I think even if you're teaching technical knowledge, i.e. history, i.e. the history of ideas, going on the fly in a way shows that the teacher of that information has grasped some kind of essential idea within that history in some sense. Like they've experienced the essence of what that information was pointing to, like, and then I think you can talk about the separation between abstraction and reality. Like the abstraction is the idea of that thing. The teacher may be in some kind of very traditional sense, like experienced the thing and then was using representation through teaching to talk about the experience of that thing. I wouldn't frame it like this because I don't really believe the division between representation and actuality. But in some sense, you can talk like this. In terms of teaching, I think that's completely true. This Sherman talks about, he quotes Nietzsche, actually. He quotes this phrase from Nietzsche where he says, there, that mountain, there, that cloud, what in them is real. And I guess as a teacher, that's what you're trying to point to, is the reality of the real. Nietzsche says, merely eliminate from them the phantasm of any human addition, you sober ones, if only you could. So it's basically saying to the rationality of his time, stop thinking that you're sober and that you're having like contact with the thing in itself. There is always this thing called the human addition. Existence, subjectivity, ideas, interpretations, particular perspectives that when you try to participate in some kind of meta-narrative of truth, you'll always find this error. You'll always find this excessive part to that technical scheme, which introduces itself and problematizes each. So Sherman talks about, he calls it like sovereign reference of like those principles that grounded our experience. So broken hegemonies is to say that every linguistic mode of understanding the world is always subject to tragedy. It's always subject to the tragic conditions of error, of desire, of bodily trauma. It's very 20th century philosophy, actually. And this is his context for the works, and he works through this and uses Heidegger to get to some awareness of the fact that error in a way is the pathway or error, you can even think of error as anxiety. Error or anxiety, because error induces anxiety. If you find yourself wanting to like stabilize yourself in one particular meta narrative, error induces anxiety. But then for him, error is the beginning of, and even Daniel, you said shepherding. Like we have to shepherd error. This is Heidegger's point. Like you shepherd being when you shepherd error, because being in itself is not some sort of tragic impossibility. It's that initial, like error is the initial space where things start to deground themselves, where the meta narratives of our common sense starts to be seen as kind of contingent historical interpretations. And in that experience, we can introduce surprise or mystery. And at that point, not by doing anything, but in some sense, and I didn't want to say this, by letting things happen, like by letting the historical horizon also continue. So it's not like you're then at that point getting to the mountain or the cloud in itself. You're continuing with a specific historical narrative to understand yourself, with a specific historical interpretation of technique, and living it, knowing at some sense that there's always the gap or space for mystery. Because there is always, in some sense, kind of something less than or excessive to that specific linguistic structure, he would say. And again, I have my problem with that because I like Hegel, and there is no difference between linguistic structure and truth, actually. And all I wanted to kind of connect this with the original point of this was to talk about teaching, like how teaching. So I would say my best moments of teaching myself personally has been when it's been on the fly, you know. And again, this is a compliment of this space. It's like everyone's kind of being more or less on the fly, and that's why you call it the net. Like you're catching awarenesses, even if they've been like, because of course, like we have to read books and listen to people talk. We have to be open to knowledge in a very technical way. Like if you read the history of Plato's ideas and even his life, of course, there's a kind of labor which is very technical. It's very knowledge based. It's very like there is a technique to that reading. There is a technique to that kind of absorbing of information, and even maybe some sense like a technique to holding that information and being able to eloquently share that information. But I think the essence of truth, the essence of experience or experiencing phenomenologically and then translating that into ontology is to allow yourself to be surprised by the fact that, oh, I can spontaneously recall this. You know, we spoke about this before on the net, like recalling something, like allowing things to come forth, memory, like how do you remember something is kind of by trusting the fact that I've heard your guys' perspective before and I've enjoyed it, and I like this conversation. Like the first half was really interesting and I was silent because I was like, yeah, like optimization in specific like booking.com, and it's very optimized towards capital. So yeah, of course it's like, and I was like, oh nice, this is good. It makes me sense like how that sort of optimization of technology, it seems to make things more efficient, but in the end it actually makes these spaces of like impossibility. And I'm sitting here like, yeah, I'm learning, like this is information. It's helping me understand and coordinate my experience, you know. Even I had an EasyJet flight 3 days ago and they cancelled it without any reason. Luckily, the person who was sharing this information on the ground was super nice. But there was like a block in the system where I had to rebook the flight through the app. But by then everybody else had booked their flight because I had no internet. So then I had to book 2 days after. And then I had to pay for all the stuff, and then they will refund me in about 5 years, you know? And it's like, oh, there's a system around this where it's like, I can't move. The lady was not able to move. I understood her position, and she was very friendly. She was like, look, I will help you as much as I can within this specific capitalization framework. I was like, oh, okay, fine. Yeah, and I was like, okay, I accept that that's this optimized system for making money for EasyJet. And it's fine, like because it is what it is in that sense, unfortunately. La 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 la. And then, but now the last 20 minutes has kind of got to this idea of teaching, which for me is like, how do you optimize teaching? I think you have to be quite spontaneous and also learned in the sense that you read books. And then this is the interesting part for me because I'm also doing the PhD. I'm nearly finished. See you later, Andrew. And like how do I like what guarantees like I'm doing a PhD in order to get a certification. I think everything I'm doing now, more or less I'm doing it by myself. But in the end, hopefully I get the certification and then I can go into the next position, you know. I wouldn't do it otherwise. Like I can do this through reading books, making notes, coming onto here. Like I learn more from the net than I do from my university, technically. Like I would say this completely, obviously, it's not even a not even a thing. No disrespect to my supervisors, but they're stressed, they're busy. You know, one's a nihilist, so there's a kind of malaise there. We're not nihilists here, we're a life affirmers, you know. So that makes it more enriching and rich. But then that's the question, like how would you then prove that you've read those books or have a perspective on those books, which makes you a teacher or makes you a researcher, you know? And of course, like to be a researcher, it's good to publish things, and then you kind of can prove by either, like, for example, writing. Obviously, my writing's developed the last few years, but if you asked me 7 years ago, like, would you want to write one day? I'd say, I can't write. Like, what? Like, I don't mind reading, I don't mind making notes and stuff. But then, of course, you learn that skill. And I guess what you said, like, there is your experience and your conversation and even your writing proves it in some sense. But the problem is the university doesn't even really care about that. I know someone who's helping me a lot. But the university doesn't care. They want your CV to be full up of publications. And I've realized from contacts that I have, it's who you know and it's how they publish in a very, and it can be a very artificial way. But of course, there still has to be a certain standard, you know, because otherwise philosophy today would not publish you if you're not thinking certain things. And again, there is, and I think this is the problem with the critique against the university. Like the university can publish very, very beautiful things. It's just not well published in the sense of it's not actually going to those communities that would be enriched by it until 30 or 40 years after. Like I've read some articles that have been published the last 4 years in terms of hermeneutics and phenomenology that I'm like, oh, it's a shame that this is not being pulled into the light of the net, you know, the light of day. Like this information, this truth is in Plato's cave, but like no one's talking about it in the cave. But if they did, this would be interesting. But because of the framework around it, it's like, yeah, you're published in this journal. Cool, like nice. And like 5 people have read it and they might talk about it for an hour and then stop. But like this is the nice thing about this. This is recorded. It's on the net. I can share it with my friends. Everyone shares it with their own people, and it's a stimulating conversation. I saw a friend last week who was like, "Oh, I watched that net thing," and I was like, "Oh." I was like, really? In person as well. It's on this like little Greek island. They're like, yeah, the one where you spoke about this, and I found it really cool how like everybody had. And I was like, oh, nice. Like, there you go, because it's recorded and it's shared, and there's like this live thing happening, which I think people really they enjoy it because it's conversational, and it's like when Thomas speaks about like the beauty and the good, like I'm really engaged because I'm like, oh, that's such an like the way you clarify it's obviously showing that you've read it, but not only that you've read it, but that you've got to it, that you agree with it, and probably I'm still yet to hear it. You disagree in some moments, you know, or you have a perspective. I'm still to hear that. I'm waiting to hear that. Or like there's something, you know, and like that's why then if I knew that you were doing the course and I was a rich man, etc., I would say, okay, let's do this course. Let me find out. Like I want to dig deep, you know. But then this is the other pleasure. This is free for people to access as well. Where, like you said, to do a course in today's climate, like it's you need to be either heavily in debt or just rich but wanting to use that capital for education, or just lucky enough in some ways, you know. But yeah, those are my 2 pennies.
Absolutely brilliant. I'll give it to Mr. Jockin. I have this wonderful image of someone on that little Greek island flipping through the TV at the bar, and they're like, hey, go back. What was that about bookings.com? Exactly. So they're just flipping through the
in
channel.
Greek as well. In
like,
Greek.
It's just like exactly. You said a lot right there. You know, that was really wonderful. You know, on that airplane example too. Like that's the problem. People are like, I'm so eager to help you within this frame. And if it's not in this frame, it's not my fault. I can't help you. So it creates also technology allows this way to seem like a good person while doing nothing good. And that's the problem, because you can say, yeah, man, I'm a really good person, but I can't do anything good for you because it's outside the frame. And that's an interesting kind of game that can be played with these technological frames of being good without doing good, right? Because it's out of my control. And look, yeah, that's always been a space in human reality where if life throws things at you that are out of your control, we understand that good people can't always do the good because of those things. But now, because in a sense, meta-awareness, there's a gamification. Like there's a knowing I can use the protocol to be seen that way, to play it, which isn't virtuous. At that point, it's not virtuous because you're using the things outside of your control to be a good person without being good. And that's exactly what you're doing intentionally. So now it's vice. But that's all the crazy game of, well, then how do you tell who is good then, right? We're at the age where the surprise and the improv seems really unavoidable in some necessary way. And basically then the good, basically the moral judgment then is this situation was created to make it so that there was no ability for a human to act in terms of surprise. Therefore, this is not good because it has removed the possibility of the conditions of encountering the good. Mr. Wynn.
That's an interesting point, but that's kind of going back what I wanted to say about surprise is like, for example, if you meet somebody, which like if I have met somebody and I've done something that I've been surprised that I've done for them because they've made me surprised and I like them and then I'm surprised by the actions that I'm doing. Like I might buy like an apple for someone and say like, oh, here's an apple. It doesn't mean anything, but for me, it was a surprise that I wanted to buy this person an apple. But within the game, it's like, what's your intention? What's your use? And I think that's what was going to what Luber was saying, you know? Like we live in that world of utility and usefulness where it's like, actually, this act was surprised me because I didn't do this for some kind of intention. And the problem is that that will be viewed within that specific game. And of course, like in some senses, some surprises break through the game. Even this Sherman talks about this. He talks about, what does he say with this? There's a nice word he uses, talking about how the tragedy, I think he's like the tragedy pierces through these institutions of language, like something tragic pierces through. And then you can think of tragic as surprise, or like it doesn't have to be negative or positive. Like tragedy in itself isn't always a negative. It's just like a shock to the system in some sense, you know? And I think that is that human addition or addition of being in that sense, which can shock the game. And I think that's the point, is always even being ready for shock, yeah? And even politically, like the system is how it is now, but events will radically reframe the very game or undo the game or question the game. Like for example, the Conservative Party in the UK were hegemonic for 15 years. Within the space of 1 month, everybody just like they disappeared, basically disappeared. And Labour came into power, but not because of them being good. It's just literally the vacuum was just there. So the game finished within 1 month, and no one really knew why, because they've always been semi-corrupt. For a Western democracy, they've been very corrupt. But like within 1 month, the game ended, and it's like, oh, okay, Labour. It's strange, like, and I think that's the thing. Like within thinking, within logic, within games, we can be ready for the error. We can be ready for the breakdown, the change, the shift. And I think, especially in terms of human relationships, that's an important point to be in. Like I'm ready to be surprised by my own surprise, you know, because actually in those instances, when I've been away the last month, it's like, oh, I've been surprised by how I don't have to be even ready for a surprise. I can just be surprised. And that's the point. I can be. And in that sense, I don't have to achieve anything. I can be surprised. I can be surprised by my accumulation of knowledge. I can be surprised by my forgetfulness. Good. I can't dictate that in some way. And I think that's where learning happens. But the problem is with certification and qualification, that really can't grasp that virtue, the virtue of surprise. Or the surprise of virtue in that sense, you know?
No, it's 100%. And like you were saying, critically to all this, like shepherding being is shepherding error. And this is because error is the opportunity for virtue and surprise. Like you shepherd being and shepherding error, but not for error's sake, because error is the space of lack and virtue, possibility, and beauty, right? And so that's the issue. And so like it makes me think when Ebert will talk about suboptimal, right? Like you have to be suboptimal in order to achieve the tyranny of to avoid the tyranny of efficiency. Well, you're doing that not for suboptimal sake, but to create the conditions in which error can be encountered so that virtue can shine, or you can actually get a real test. And this for me on a systems level is really important because I strongly believe that people are using technology to create spaces where people can be good people, but incapable of the good. So what that does is create this pathological all these problems we've been talking with bookings.com, shame on you. What this means is you are not virtuous if you intentionally create a space where people can be good people with being incapable of the good. Because what you're doing is removing surprise. Because what you're saying is you're in a way replacing virtue with goodness. Like you're replacing good people or nice people with virtue, if you will, right? And that's what you're doing. So if you want to be a virtuous person and you're building a system or a business or a space, you must very intentionally allow, it must be one where good people can do the good. Because that means there must be the possibility of error. And human action must always be part of your system, or it cannot be virtuous, because human action is the possibility of error. That's the joke. We're removing human action from our systems because we don't want error. But error is the condition of being in virtue. And so by removing that, there is no possibility of virtue. There's no possibility of beauty, only niceness and aesthetic. And then we wonder why we're not human and we have a meaning crisis. I think the last thing I'll say, and then I'll give it to Mr. Jockin, is one of the reasons, like you're talking about these journals, right? One of the reasons I'm bullish on the liminal web is precisely there is no possibility of every single human being reading every single journal. But I've read like journals and PhDs that have been like, wow, this work, like Wilson and Austin Fair, whatever, like this is mind-blowing, right? Well, if you had a lot of people autodidactically reading journals or finding these things and bringing it to net spaces, then you could have a coordination of these. A lot of people are like, well, this is what ChatGPT will do. They're going to do it through summarization. And, you know, maybe, possibly, but you would still have to read the summaries of the ChatGPT. And by the way, they're summaries, right? You need a human gathering system, right? And there's a way in which the gathering of being is possible with the human because it's the gathering of potential mistake, misreading, and error. But that's all why virtue becomes possible because of that risk, right? And so to me, the question of technology extending humanity versus replacing humanity is making sure that technology is never used to remove the possibility of error. To actually, in a way, be more efficient at spaces of error or spaces of surprise. Like to become more efficient at encountering surprise, like to make the surprise more efficient, not to remove the surprise, right? Like a hip hop cipher, you can be very efficient on making the space of the improvisation. You can have the speaker, like let's talk a jazz improvisation. You can have the speakers work. You can check the sound. You can make sure the distance of the, you can be incredibly efficient in making the space of the improvisation. That's where efficient space thinking is supposed to go. Not the most efficient thing is like, well, let's just play a record. Let's just have a ChatGPT jazz improvisation play on the loudspeaker, right? That would, if you think about it, be the most cost-effective, efficient way to do it, right? But that's where everything sucks then. No, what you want to do is say, how do we be the most efficient at creating a space where error is possible, but actually the grandeur can be amplified because if you have a really amazing jazz improvisation, but the audio sucks, then the beauty's not going to shine forth, right? Like if it's fuzzy or the speaking. So you want to really be efficient in creating the conditions to let be the beauty if it comes forth, but not to replace the conditions of the letting be to come forth. I'll get Mr. Wynn.
Very quickly, I think this came up when we spoke before. Like I think Luber was here as well, and it was we were talking about this idea of the good and beauty, and I had this idea like, well, what if you have a good, meaning in my understanding, like a frame of knowing, a frame of inspiring, like towards something which will never be beauty, but you strive towards it. What if you strive towards this awareness of efficiency and this awareness of the very difference between the good and the beauty, in the sense that you can say, like, I want to use efficient means to get my PhD as quick as possible, so then I can place myself in a teaching where I can open up to the virtue and surprise, and even teach the knowledge of the fact that you can't achieve that, etc. And I think this is like the point within a certain system of today's society, which obviously differs in different countries in some sense. Like how can I maximize efficiently the usefulness of arriving to these places which can be orchestrated for surprise and for example, this is the point, like in some sense I would like to have a position where I'm not working too much, or I'm working in a field which it engages with that surprise, And that's the thing, like, and this is why some people do strive towards jobs where they can work kind of crappy jobs for a minimal amount of hours, earn enough money to then allow them to have more free time to be in those moments of surprise in that sense. And I think in that sense, we can be very practical. And I think that's why like letting be in that sense is very practically engaged, because you say, well, I want to let my time be opened to, etc., etc. And then you can say, well, let's make some decisions to put me in that space. let me try and live in this different country in that city, you know? And if it's like, oh, it's nice, but I'm spending 11 hours a day in that specific job, which doesn't pay well because the money here is not that too great and the rent's really high because of tourism. Like, even if the place itself is very nice, like I'm not getting to enjoy that, you know? I'm not able to experience that. So then you can be practical and say, okay, let's be efficient with my time in a calculative way, only to then maximize the opening of time for that different quality of meditative thinking, what Heidegger would say, or, you know, like the space of mystery or surprise or beauty in that sense.
No, I think that's brilliantly put. I think being efficient about creating the field of surprise, which is the field of error, which is the free field of beauty, that's the proper role of efficient thinking. But because error is scary, we then overfit efficiency and remove the possibility of surprise in the human. And it's a major problem. But let me give it to Mr. Jockin. Mr. Jockin, please.
Yeah, these are all excellent points. I mean, a lot was said. I'll start with the back, my notes at the end. You know, by the way, actually, your notes, Thomas, about your best experiences working with students. I think I have my note here about similarity and difference. Because I always find that very interesting, because you know why? Because technically everything is similar to everything else, and everything's different from everything else, right? It depends on which framework we're looking at. And in fact, there's a reason, also use my explanation mark at one part, because educators absolutely, I know this personally, like I'm guilty of it. Essays, any long form of qualitative discourse that I have to evaluate and then mark up and write, I loathe. The optimization, like the pressures needed of educators to not align to that outcome. So we are basically driven by our metrics to basically do the multiple choice exam, the get true or false claim, basically things that are like dimension reduction, complexity reduction, versus, and even I've seen bad educators, like if a student proposes a similarity or difference that's unexpected, like it's a little outside the domain of the context, what I've seen professors do, educators do, is instead of thinking through, why would you say that? Or like work through, how could you creatively see a connection, right? They say, no, it doesn't count. That's not part of the equation. They're prefixing what is the bounds of the account, which similarity and difference inherently challenges if you take it seriously, because everything is similar and everything is different. It depends on which accounts we're going to use to discuss that. So that's the first note. And qualitative mechanism or instruments like writing is supposed to do that. Writing in theory is supposed to be a way of you working through your mind, building relationships and qualitative dynamics, right? That's ideally its purpose. But very rarely is it done the case. And especially using things like ChatGPT to do the writing for you obfuscates that operation. Especially when you're trying to create innovative thinking, like kind of interesting dynamics of similarity and difference. I'll just chew on that for a little bit. But that's more on the teachers don't want to grade that. I know this personally. I did that 1 year, hated it, didn't do it after that, because I'm like, I can't afford this. I can't afford. I have 30 students. I can't read their, you know. It's definitely I definitely cut down the duration of writing, which could be useful. I went from 1,200 words down to 500 to 250 real quick, because I was like, I have to optimize. I can't afford this to take hours for me to review, consider their thought, see the error in their thought, give recommendations of what to look at, and then see where their error is and explain the error and why it's too much. I can't afford it for 30 students. Anyways.
Just can I say one thing? This goes back
yes.
to the beginning of the conversation with optimization that shows how the education system has been optimized to be time efficient because they have to pay educators. And because the system within which education exists in the UK, for example, my friends who are educators, high school teachers, university lecturers, etc., they've been thrown into a system of optimization where they are restricted in their time. The students increase. And that means there are these pressures because the system, and that's what's reducing this possible experience. If you had 10 people in your classroom and you were given more time and more resources, including wage, of course, I'm sure you would enjoy that if you had the time. If that time was not consuming your own in that sense, you know. And again, that goes to this idea of optimization for what? What's the end, you know?
Yes. But I'm not building that part, because that's the point, is that we're paid for the credit in the United States, we're paid credit hours. So it's the credit hours of the class, not our time. So you get paid a certain amount per credit hour. Like if it's 3 credits, you get a multiple of 3 to whatever that rate is, as an example. But that's the point. You notice that it's only in the actual instruction hours of 3 hours, not everything at before or after. So again, these are, yeah, I would absolutely agree. It's the result of an optimization quantified by time. And that, but see, that's the point though, is that legally, that is in the United States, that's our legal mandate. That is our infrastructure. We are paying for those credit for those interactions and to do the evaluations of the students in that time frame. So you're going to naturally get the outcomes you get. And that's even independent of the quantity of students. Like that definitely pressure points on that. That's an additional pressure on that, but it's true. I would say it's two of those factors combined. I agree with you. The other note, by the way, Daniel, your note about this idea of like, you got to give people the capacity to actually do good for the good to actually be the case. This is the actually mirror image of the banality of evil reference point. It's exactly it. Because that's the point. It's that like notice the banality of evil has always had orientation around a bureaucracy structure. Hey, listen, my job is not to worry about what this is towards or what it's worried about. I just got to make sure this train hits this station. Don't think about it. Don't think about what's going on those trains and where those trains going to go and what's going to happen to those entities that are on that train. Don't think about it. So just do your job. Be good as doing your job, right? So I think I'm noting that in my notes that came up to me. And by the way, this idea of protecting error, protecting surprise, like I think that's a very important quality because that's the point. Everything is optimized to avoid that. Liability is built on the presumption of removing surprise and error because then we're liable for it. So that's there's some tensions about that. I think about that a lot. But the big thing is that a lot of them are built on obfuscating error. You want to obfuscate it. You want to get it out the picture. They don't even, black is nothing. Degree is nothing. It doesn't exist. It's not part of the equation. I think the last note, just kind of chewing on what's been said, I really think actually a big aspect of this is that ability to respond, the improv response. I actually think, again, that's actually, I think genius. I think that's actually probably like the biggest insight from this conversation is I feel very comfortable with that answer because it's true. If you have literally, as they say, no prep time, if you got no Batman prep time to like get ready for something and it's appeared to you and you have to respond to it, there is no obfuscation. There is no chance to remove the possibility of a false presentation. It's here. And especially in response to particular subjects in a particular moment. And actually, I'm gonna counter one argument because you just said like in that example of improv performances, making sure the mic's working, the audio is working. No, actually, I would say the best experts can respond to even when there's a disaster. And I'll give an example. I had to speak. I had a book launch for a chapter I got. Like so, I contributed a chapter to this, and the book launch was originally at a university, had to get moved off campus because of protests that were happening related to Gaza. Then it was at the bar. And then at the bar, we found out that they didn't have a mic. They didn't have an audio system. And then I presumed, oh, well, then we're renting out the whole bar. So who cares? This will be us in a room. Oh, no, actually not. So actually it was Friday night happy hour with a room of like 50 people who were trying to have their appetizers and drinks. And I got to sit there in front of all these other PhDs and all that, and other faculty and designers and give my talk in that environment. And guess what? I did it. I actually was really impressed. My colleagues who saw me speak afterwards, like, you know what, Tom, I'm amazed you did that. That was amazing because even under those extreme circumstances, you still were able to deliver the information in the presentation. Like that's so I would just say actually, the best expert. It actually and tie back to my original point with Thomas and the idea of the power of similarity and difference in response to particular students is not dismiss the error, like kick it out, like get rid of it and get tripped up about it. It's to respond to it. Like that true power of creativity is the response to limitation, which is a huge aspect. The biggest danger of abstraction is that it takes you away from the material conditions. There's a reason why Aristotle has material necessity and hypothetical necessity. It's both. Basically, the helomorph is the combination of both material necessity of particular demands, usually met by restraint, limitation, and error, and the hypothetical necessity of for the sake of which. So, for example, the house is the usual example of this. The house is both a combination of the material necessity of matter, of materials of stone being certain weight, hay being certain weight, gravity being certain condition, et cetera, people being certain sizes, for example, right? All these are material necessities that the house must conform to and respond to actually be a house. And then there's the question of, but then you're not just, these things are not just gathered together randomly. They're there for a reason, for a sake of, right? And this is the key, is that ideally, as we move into higher levels of meta thinking and abstraction, is that those move us towards material ends of shelter to then things like, for example, bring community together, bring a family together, religious observation, eventually the highest order to beauty, which, by the way, never destroys the lower goods, but always orients together. So actually, Thomas, your main question, like kind of like on the question, the beautiful and the good, I generally stand on a kind of, so instead of a pure Trinity argument of all three concentric circles kind of working together like this in a Trinitarian mode, I do hold the stance of concentric circles getting larger. I hold that stance at this point. I find from general the arguments and presentations, I think that's the most reasonable argument, meaning that the beautiful, the kalos, must entail the agatha, the good and the true must be entailed in it. Like you have to have all three entailed. They cannot be destroyed or obfuscated. So actually, that's why even traditional fine art training, which says goods are omitted and not even considered in the discussion, are false. They're aesthetics because they obfuscate the good and the true. And in fact, in reality, it must be in participation with those two as well. But that could be challenged. I'm very nervous about that stance, but that'd be my short answer on that point. And my drawing out of these cases is to show that, because when you're oriented towards the beautiful, that kind of orientation, that means even in surprise, even in error, you transform it. So this kind of discussion of the last note basically literally forgives. This is actually a notion of forgiveness in computer science, that when users make errors, systems are more robust that can forgive, meaning that in response to the error, they don't just shut down or blow up the whole thing. It takes that into account. It's similar to that, why, like the very beginning, Daniel, the Barnes example, HTML, even though you do shit code and all full of errors, it still will render because those are forgiving systems. They can forgive. Then in that sense, they're actually they're kind of very subtle glimpses of the beautiful, in the sense that those allow for reality of goodness and truth to show through. Very small glimpses, very toy examples, but it gets the idea across. But then the examples of the improv is that you don't just freak out and stop because there's some blockage of optimization occurred. You actually overcome it. And in fact, even your nature of people responding to circumstance, to trial, and coming and being able to do good is because of that. That's the whole point, is that they're able to not be trapped into the system of optimization, that they're in this little protocol, and that's what they're going to do. Even this is the example. Actually, Thomas, you pointed out, like, you had that blockage in the flight. For example, you had this flight and there was a system breakage. The fact that that person, that representative, chose to speak with you as a human, it's so funny that that's sort of human dignity of, like, I'm sure she was very gracious with you and kind of almost addressing the thumos dignity of you, as opposed to just pure logic. The fact that you were being addressed in that way, again, outside the system. Under the system, she has no reason to do that. She could literally just be an NPC operation, to just be a vector of information to tell you, you've been denied your flight, you were blocked, I am sorry, you must rebook, please take 48 hours to expect a reply from HR. Like, in theory, she could do that. It would be in the protocols of the system. That's what she's paid to do. But she shows you something extra, something outside the bounds of that mechanism. I think about that. It's the human is the power to always draw out an account outside the supposed account that they're put into. Meaning that even if you got a shit customer job, even if you're in the worst of war or in tragedy or in disaster, there's always the opportunity to strike through with glory, in the sense of you can always strike out at some account beyond what's given to you, even in the subtle act of some act of kindness, of humanity, of addressing a human as another subject with dignity and some kind of thematic addressing that is not just a logos account of the game, basically. Which actually leads to that point before, Thomas, you brought up before, of, when someone does something nice for you, there is the idea of, like, you do it because there's a game attached to it, there's an end, it destroys it, versus a gift. And the gift is powerful because it's actually beyond the game. Meaning it's not, and not just pure arbitrary choice. In one sense it is, but it's not necessarily. It's just saying that, no, I'm not doing this for some purpose end game that we're talking about. I just like you. Like, how can you be held culpable? How could you be held in contempt for that? Like, and that's even just a simple part of like getting a gift for your wife just because, getting flowers just because you wanted to, or you just got inspired to do it versus because it's your anniversary or because it's a holiday. You see, like there's like, it's still good. It's still like affirmed, but that's within a little protocol versus doing it outside beyond the protocol. And that's a little toy example that way. But I think it's very powerful is this idea of the breaking of the banality of evil is because if one can see through any hellscape system that there's something more that can be done. And even the subtle act of being a human to give true awareness and kind of thematic addressing of a subject breaks through the system because optimizations of corporate structures do not allow for that. Usually they don't account for it. So any human being that does that is very powerful. This is the reason why things like institutions like Chick-fil-A are so, people go, why is Chick-fil-A so important? Why does Chick-fil-A have this bizarre, almost like passion drive behind it when people basically take a shit, like its product is good. It's good, but it's not like this blow up thing. Why? Because Chick-fil-A has values and principles that go beyond selling fucking chicken. And that's the thing. And people want that. They desire it. And they know it's there. I just chew on that a lot because I talk about that with my colleagues, and I'm probably saying it was so long. I'm just riffing on Type Thursday. Like I've talked with chapter leads where I tell them point blank, guys, we have systems, we have protocols, we have KPIs, we have all that talk, we have all this stuff, but we also have principles that we live by, and these KPIs are oriented towards that. They're not, and that's the key. Just because you don't realize that just because we haven't named, like we have not, like those things are embedded in our systems and the way we work together. And even I say, even very simple things where we have a thing called a mastermind where people are expected to come present what they did during the week. So an expectation of proactivity. There's a mode of active listening where there's a guidance by me to like announce who's in the room, and then everyone reports based on who showed up. They speak uninterrupted for 5 minutes, like there's a time, and then everyone's actively listening, and then it's expected everybody has to reply back, right? And it could be an affirmation, addressing questions. And there's orders, hierarchies of participation, because we have senior members on the call and junior members on the call, and I'm on the call. So we have different levels of participation, and we bring up different accounts because of our orientation. And generally the juniors ask questions. The senior members give recognition of a similar experience they had. I give meta system points of this relates to this system, this relates to this KPI, this relates to this principle. Anyway, my point is I'm bringing all this up to say these were down into the organization and into the community, and people want to come to Type Thursday and experience something different. So if someone from the outside would just think it's just basically, again, it's just a social event for the industry. But when you go in it, you realize, oh, this is more like the Chick-fil-A versus Popeyes example. Then it's just widget A to widget B. So I'm chewing on this because that's what we're getting at here is this idea of accounts having the power to strike out when they're not crushed. I think that's actually a very powerful point of true knowledge is actually getting that level. To be a disciple of the beautiful is to actually get to that level where I'm kind of riffing off a little bit now, some consequences of this. I could be challenged on any of this. This is me just ripping now, and I'm going to stop there.
No, magnificent. And if anyone has any final things, alas, I will have to run. Now it's feeling as if bookings, this whole conversation has been an example of the last note of the music, flipping it and turning it into something beautiful to work, right? That notion of forgiveness as the flip moment, the last note is the flip moment. I think that's very true. And I think, we'll send it to bookings.com. Oh, it's going to be great. I think there's a few things. I completely agree with your example of the mic not working and you're still able to rise to the occasion. That's exactly right. That's almost like, so when you're making a space, but this is where I think it's always a relationship. So if you're making a space, you wouldn't intentionally not have the mic work or different things like that, right? But then if you do your best and something surprising occurs, rather than the presenter, you getting mad at me creating the space, you take it upon yourself to see it as an opportunity of virtue, right? This is why virtue is always relational, because stuff happens that even surprises the ones doing their best, right? There's always that element, right? And so this is where because here's the problem. it's almost like game theory, like we talked. The moment like I do my best to create the space where the sound works and it screws up, in a way, there's a kind of strong, the strong strategy is for you as the presenter to get mad, because then you can be seen as the victim. And if you don't do a good job, it's not your fault. There's an incentive for you to actually blame me. And here's the trick. It is my fault. You would be justified to do it. But you in virtue see that you see beyond rationality, if you will. You see beyond what would be beneficial to you in the game theory strategy, right? You see that actually doing something different is the most virtuous, but that's non-rational. That's menti-divergent. That's beyond the game theory dynamic, right? And so you're seeing beyond that. Yeah, Mr. Luber, we're still talking about bookings.com, but alas, I will run and get ready for our meeting on the book here and other thing. But you're seeing beyond it, but you actually do have incentive to blame me, right? Or to blame what do people do? They blame the microphone. Yeah, it would have been a good presentation, but the freaking mic didn't work. That's all the same thing. Virtue, in a way, if we go back to what we were saying, that technology to me does function as the scapegoat still. We're not beyond it. We just don't allow ourselves to kill scapegoats we can see. Because if we did that, then we'd have to admit we're using it. But metacognition has arisen to where, well, we're just going to use the technology to escape. Well, likewise, there's always that. It would have been great if not for the guy running the space. It would have been great if not for the speaker. In a way, virtue as the awareness of the alternative account is always a repetition, if we use that Girard notion, which I know Cleo critiques, but if we just use it generally, that's the opportunity of the sacred. Like, you're always given a sacred violence opportunity. A violence has been done on you that is not just. The guys didn't have the microphone right. Reality was not just. They screwed you. You worked really hard to get this presentation together, and reality has screwed you. You have been a victim of a kind of sacred violence. And rather than just, in a way, justly blame that, you say, no, I'm going to rise to its occasion. And there's a higher, it turns out that justice in the beautiful is greater. You're not collapsing. You say, I see this as an opportunity for beauty, right? And so you're rising it. And that's the opportunity of, in a sense, repeating the sacred violence of Girard for the sake of beauty. Mr. Jockin.
Just to jump in. And actually, the reason I also brought this account up was to show, like, so for example, one of the qualities of a good lecturer or a good professor is what's called vocal projection or classic management, as they call it, meaning the ability to project your voice. My God, that was the par excellence of my power. My power of voice projection was taken to the ultimate level by that challenge. No, because actually, so there's a technique where literally I had to shoot my voice within a certain range of the room, and I had to get it higher over, literally like a blanket. I use a metaphor in my mind, like a blanket over the sound of everybody else. And actually, my colleagues noticed, because we're attuned to knowing this property. When I was doing this, they would actually raise their voice in response to me. And then I was like, that's cool. And I just had to go higher up. So I had to go over them and actually hold this. It was a 15-minute speech. So I had to do this, but that's the key you have to do is without destroying your voice. It's a projection through the diaphragm. It's through that style. And then you got to kind of get your throat to kind of be like a little piss. They got it like as a hose, you kind of tighten it up. So it shoots out. You get all these techniques you figure out from anyways, my point is, I love what you're saying, Daniel, but I just want to just add in a little note. Like, this is the power. This is a capacity and power being demonstrated by the challenge of it. It's very minor detail. But you're saying it's a much more powerful, clearer point. But I just want to draw out like this idea of the true example, the beautiful actually being the most powerful as well, because it allows you. Because that's the point. If I didn't take up that contest, that challenge, there'd be no way for me to demonstrate this excellence. That's my key, which relates to a boxer who gets a strained arm, a broken hand, and still wins the fight. It's a similar metaphor. There's an excellence demonstrated when put in a challenge of limitation, and yet they overcome it. This is kind of evokings and strikings of beauty, different degrees. Just want to add that note.
No,
can you keep going, Daniel?
It's very important, because error is when you can show without showing off. And if there's no error in your society, technology is going to make us all egotists, because we have these abilities, but we know how then we're like, well, I want people to know I can project my voice. And then the ego, and it's not virtuous, and it becomes all problematic. But error is a space where capacity can show without showing off. But then you have to have the virtue to cultivate capacities that you realize you have to wait to use. And that's hard because there's always like, I want people to see my Instagram account. Like you want to show, right? But there's actually something virtuous in negating that from yourself. And that then is like, well, what if you were to die and never show this off? Then you would have had to have valued it for its own sake, by definition. So it's an opportunity to test yourself to see if you're actually gaining the capacity for its own sake and find out there's a certain difficulty in that requires cultivation. But this is the problem. I don't think it's by chance that technological efficiency and egotism go together, because the removal of error is the removal of the opportunity to show without showing off. And so you get all of the egotism that also takes off. I'll give it to Mr. Wynn here, but you know, the other thing too with that, I'm glad you brought up the banality of evil, is because that's exactly what Eichmann basically is like, I'm a good person. I was just following orders. It's the good person separate from the doing good. It's the technology is one giant continuation of the banality of evil if you're not careful. And now people are intentionally gamifying it in the name of efficiency. That's exactly what's going on. And you see, you can even call it good because it's removing error. And isn't it good to remove error? Oh, well, this is where if you collapse the good into the beautiful, you're screwed. Because beauty is like, well, beauty requires error. And without beauty, we're screwed. So you better not remove all conditions of error. Otherwise, the good collapses into the beautiful and we get Eichmann. So we better be careful with that. So this is the rub. The logic of, you know, what Nick Land wants to argue, that like basically technology is a continuation of the logic of capital. And that's true. But the logic of capital is not merely fungibility. The problem is the logic of capital is the game theory tendency to outsource responsibility to a system that removes the human element. So there's always a separation from the good person and doing good. So you can plausibly deny that you're not good as you proceed to fail to do good, which then leads to a greater outsourcing of technology that necessarily collapses the good into the beautiful, which is the banality of evil. The banality of evil is when people's everydayness is defined by a collapsing of the good and the beautiful into the good, right? That is the banality of evil. And of course, the problem with givens, with traditional belonging, is that you could easily collapse the beautiful into the good because you're simply following the givens. What is givens, right? Well, you say, well, that's bad. Throw out the banality of evil. Well, now you've thrown out the good. And now I love how you describe beautiful as a concentric circle, beautiful, good, and true. If you throw out the good, then you can't have the beautiful. So that's not the solution. Then you just end up with the true. And the truth is just scientism and facticity, and that's what we've had. And people are like, well, that's not good. That's reductionism in science. Okay, well, yeah, you need to recover the centric circles, but that's recovering error. Like saving the world is about saving error in a sense, which is hilarious. You know, a good joke. But if you do not do that, then the logic of capital, which is the logic of keeping apart the doing good from the being good, in a sense, good people from the things that are good, because that's the most efficient way to have the system optimized, then the beautiful must be collapsed into the good, and then you have the banality of evil, and there is no possibility of a flip moment because there's no error to flip. And so you can't have the possibility of the virtuous. But let me give it to Mr. Wynn. Mr. Wynn.
Yeah, just a very quick point on what Jockin was saying about the beautiful and the like raising the voice in order to like use the excellence or demonstrate the excellence for the sake of excellence. I also think that even reverts back to the ability to also not have to feel obliged to share in some sense as well, like in the sense that you recognize that you have absolute freedom to share or not to share, because like you said, Daniel, you are with it for itself, like you are being the placeholder of that knowledge for itself in a sense. So like I really think that that's where surprise and beauty happens in some sense, is when you are also aware that there are no conditional imperatives to do anything. Like I don't have to be here, like I really don't have to be here. I also don't have to eat, you know, like of course I do, but I don't have to. There's no moral, eternal imperative to do this in some sense. And I think absolute freedom comes in to show that then you encounter more like the thing itself of what you're doing, like the essence of what you're thinking. I think shines forth in perhaps I wouldn't say a brighter way, but like it shines forth when you recognize that you don't have to use it for some alternative end. And I think that's that's the space of teaching in some sense. And I think that then gives you the confidence to speak louder, is because you're not doing it for your own ego, you're doing it for the thing itself. You're doing it for the knowledge for which you're being with in some sense, you know. And I think that creates the freedom and space, and also the attitude which can let it be. And in the sense of let it be is in like not have to demonstrate it, exhibit it, but also then to want to exhibit it, to want to demonstrate it because it's beautiful.
Yeah,
And I think
Thomas,
yeah.
I don't want to interrupt you. I just want to jump in just one quick
Yeah.
point about that, and just tying with Daniel's. I know we got to go. So, with what Daniel
No.
said, Daniel's absolutely like. Here's this funny thing, Daniel. That point about like I could have blamed it rightly the technology, the organizer. Actually, you know what's funny? I didn't even think it. It wasn't even in like I could retroactively point at like by addressing like, oh yeah, that's true, but I didn't even think it wasn't even, or yeah, it really wasn't there. It was an example of like, let's put this, yeah, that absolute choice. But the point of being oriented towards the beautiful is like that's so ugly. Actually, I know what my initial reaction of thinking of, or like once I acknowledged I could have thought that, I could have done that, and I've been right to do it. My actual reaction is that's ugly. That's so ugly of my soul. That's such an ugly way to be. I didn't want to be that way. So I'm drawing. I just want to jump in and point out. Like,
even the EasyJet example, like if I started to be, and some people were agitated with the person who's sharing the information about the failure of the optimization of EasyJet's policy concerning cancellation, etc. Like it's ugly to introduce this in that moment to that person because this person is not the system. They're just paid to be the vocalization of the failure of the optimization, and that is ugly in that system, in that moment. So the only reaction there is to let it be and say, okay, like that is how this is happening. Yes, the mic is not working, but however I am in that situation, I can kind of be with the beauty by not having to feel like obliged to become ugly in some sense, like to give space to it. And in your sense, it's different because your task in that moment was to talk, yeah. But then you could, in that sense, you could preserve beauty. But maybe in my sense, it was like, okay, like I'm lucky enough. I have a friend in Athens. I can stay with them for a couple of days. They're a beautiful person. They would host me, you know. So I think there is a way of being, or a way of encountering, or a way of, or a quality of encountering, which I think can maintain beauty in any situation. And I think that is what it means to let be in some sense, is to kind of say, well, I can let this knowledge be despite the conditions around it. And that also means me sharing it in this moment or not being able to. But I forgive myself, I forgive the knowledge in that situation in some sense. But then that would inspire you more to say, no, actually, this is interesting. I want to talk above the volume of the people in this room in some sense. And I think that's the point, that the natural tendency then it rises up.
Okay, so that's the point. It's also once I made that choice to go towards the beautiful, then I actually became a joy of the challenge. How can I over basically now becomes a project of interest. Like it comes now of like, how do I get that? Like literally this whole account of like a cloth going over the volume of the other and noticing all that. But by the way, I just want to point out, Thomas, in your example, you're more the recipient of the beautiful. You're the recipient of it. I would say actually that employee, she had the choice. In your example, it was she had the choice to operate on the beautiful or not. And that's the thing. You were more the recipient of it, I would say, in the toy example on this parallel point. But I grant your point, though, in terms of generally, like you could choose, like that act of letting things to be is, I agree with that point too. I'm saying that, but there's also attaching up, so when there is a motion of action, there is that ultimate choice, as Daniel said, you could choose to be beautiful or ugly in your choice in response to a circumstance of error. I think that's totally true as well.
Yeah, just one quick thing on this. I think that is the point, like even as a recipient, because I saw recipients of this person's beauty become quite ugly towards her. And it's like in this situation, but I think what's interesting, this doesn't mean being passive as like letting things be, because it actually becomes more engaged. Because in that moment, I think I became very aware of the fact, like now from this net session, I have the words to talk about the failure of the optimization of EasyJet's policy, blah, 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 blah. But at the time I was like, yeah, fuck this. Like they're obviously making money from this. They'll obviously only do things that will pay back in a certain way, because of course they don't care because it's optimized to work in this way, you know? But I think like beauty can be held between people's sharing this information, receiving this information, and also a critique which says this structure is not efficient for human experience of like creative endeavors when shitty things like this are optimized in a negative way for human experience. And I think that's the point. Like you can experience a moment of failure in the situation around you, like the microphone not working, or having to go to a bar and there's too many people and they're loud. But I think when you engage with the freedom to forgive yourself for not even being able to do it in those conditions, that inspires the natural energy to want to, I think. And that's the power of the beauty. It compels you despite the conditions around you. And I think even to the point where you can also say, I don't have to do this right now because I know that despite this current situation, I can enjoy the beauty of this knowledge another time for myself in any moment. But then I think, again, that sort of freedom, which is a more radical freedom, even then still wants to inspire you to do it. And I think this is all my point was like, I think even what you said about HTML, the fact that it forgives, it forgives, it forgives. Forgiveness, I think, in terms of the beauty is its fundamental character in some sense, in the sense that I really think I have no obligation to learn things in my life. My eternal destiny has no relationship to my knowledge. But knowing that, that gives me the freedom to inquire because I feel free to, because I feel inspired by life to teach me or to not teach me. I feel inspired by other people's information to be shared with me or not. You know, like that's the freedom I think that the knowledge has and gives in some sense, like the freedom to know or the freedom not to know, the freedom to experience beauty or not to experience beauty. Like I think there's no imperative to experience beauty apart from beauty's sake in that sense. I mean, that's my point, is like this is the radicality of beauty, is you don't need to experience it, but it's beautiful. Like that, like so when if I was there and I was listening and I heard this excellence, then of course I encountered the excellence for excellence sake. And I think that's what inspired you to do it, not because you felt egotistical about having to outcompete the people in that room. And I think that has to do with forgiveness. And I think that's where it becomes more radical because you realize you don't have to do it. Like there's literally no imperative to it, but you do it because it's excellence for excellence sake. There, that's my point. I think that's what's radical in some sense about it. Like it's just you're free not to. And when you realize you're free not to, it makes it more of an imperative because you're free to, yeah, anyway,
I know. I mean, Thomas, there's a very strong tension there. It's very fun because it's the uncompelled compeller, right? That's what love is supposed to be about ultimately. And that's kind of what we're drawing out here is how can you be compelled, be motivated and coordinated by something that is not a necessity, but yet once you're committed, it becomes a necessity. It becomes a no question. There's no hesitation. And it's actually a kind of a kenosis kind of self-emptying, kind of removal of the ego, and a kind of act of like, I'm here for service. I'm here just to participate in being in a dance. So there's like all these tension points where it can be so easily, again, look how complicated this is. Look how quickly, if we had to give this a dimension, give me a summary of this, a dimension reduction, it'd be so quick and easy to get to obfuscate what's actually in play here. But no, I think this has been a beautiful conversation. I will say that.
No, I've enjoyed it immensely. And the summary is bookings.com sucks, but because we have the net, we have an opportunity to flip it and make it an opportunity for beauty. So thank you, bookings.com, for the error. That was an opportunity. We really appreciate it. So there's a few things that come to mind. And I've really appreciated this. And alas, I will have to run. First, on the introduction problem, the reason why I think all of this is tied to the introduction problem is because basically overcoming that is the question of how do you have people bring structure versus rely on structure that's already there. If there's structure already there, it could be neurotic. It has to have these inefficient mechanisms of like giving everyone a common basis, thus teaching them what the thing is there, as opposed to if you bring virtue or bring knowledge or bring things, and there's a way in which you bring structure. Like in jazz, you bring structure in knowing how to play the instrument. You bring structure in having experience, right? So the difference, like if we're going to talk about a form of belonging again, that is not based on various neurotic structures, it has to be one where structure is brought and put in relation, as opposed to brought and flattening everyone down. And Mr. Wynn, if your battery dies, that will be an error for an opportunity of showing virtue instead of like throwing it through the window. So, an opportunity for beauty. So what you see there is bringing structure to be in relation that instead of relying on structure and neurotic. So there has to be something about belonging again, that is people bringing structure. But one of the main things that get in the way of that is the introduction problem. And so thinking through more efficient manners to increase the probability that people can bring structure to a situation, bring virtue, bring capacities by which to make it beautiful, to actually bring about flip moments, because it's only a matter of time before any given structure has error. And if the people there can't flip it and instead do the dominant strategy and game theories to flatten it, then it's lost, right? You need people there to be able to do the flip moment to keep the structure going. That's also why at the end of 2-1, we'll talk about forgiveness. Forgiveness is such a big deal, because if you have systems that are not dominated by technological reasoning, ergo the banality of evil, then there must be a human element. If there's a human element, there will be error. And if there's error, then there has to be forgiveness to keep that from blowing the whole thing up. And forgiveness is precisely the capacity to do this flipping, this ability to sort of flip. Grace, exactly, Mr. Wynn. So I think it all ties in that sense. The dynamic, the logic that you were putting forth, Mr. Jockin, on this kind of self-forgetfulness, seeing the situation as an opportunity for capacity, all of this is impossible to think without beauty. Like, it's completely impossible, because if you walk in and you say, oh, it'd be good of me not to make a big deal, well, you're really focused on yourself then. You haven't done self-forgetful. How do you walk in and say, oh, I'm going to, rise it, and not be thinking about yourself being the kind of person that can do it? It has to be, I'm going to do it for the beautiful. I'm going to do it because it would be beautiful to actually, in this era, manage to do the presentation over it, and it would be beautiful. And here's the trick about beauty. It's not beautiful just for who? You. It's beautiful for everyone. There's something memorable about, wow, we went to that bar and Jockin was able to give that presentation. Wow, there was something beautiful about that, right? And so it is not egotistical, but it is also not the poisonous, selfless at your expense, because that's a problem too, right? Where you are sacrificing the self for the other. How do you do both? The only way to get that logic is beauty. But here's the other trick. The only way to be able to walk into a space and have the logic of beauty take over, if you will, is because you bring capacity, because you bring structure, because you've trained, because you've worked, right? It's seemingly the only way to have self-forgetfulness in the proper way, like we'll talk about with Timothy Keller, and basically like you're not even thinking about, you're not even thinking about it. You're just self-forgetful. It seems to require the cultivation of skills that you don't know you're going to use. And then, so this is where I think the grace comes in that Mr. Wynn stresses. When you walk into an error situation and you've been working to develop these skills that you don't know you'll ever use, you go, it's a grace. Here it is. The surprise. I can show without showing off. And then it's also a grace because it's for the beauty. You're not thinking about yourself showing instead of showing off. You're showing for the beauty that encapsulates. So the error is something like, oh my gosh, it's a gift. There's an error. By definition, I can't plan for an error. And I have this capacity to self-forgive myself, and beauty can come. So error suddenly becomes a gift. So rather than using that dominant strategy of blaming them, like you're saying, you don't even think about it. Well, no, because error is an opportunity for something memorable, for something outside the logic of efficiency, something human, something that's actually praising the human capacity over the reliance on an external circumstance as a handicap. Humans can act without the handicap of the external, with the capacity that they have been holding for its own sake that they find good in when they encounter the error by which the beauty can shine forth. But that requires the logic of the mentorship, the training, the working, and the lot for the sake of a beauty that you know that you cannot summon by your own power. But if in the space of error, there's an opportunity to show without showing off, and because you develop the skill for its own sake, because you found a good in it, thus you can let be. The grace is that letting be of the beautiful. And then the trick, and this is where the efficient thinking comes in. So if you have this opportunity, it would not actually be adequate. You then efficiently must work to make sure it doesn't happen again, right? But the reason you have to work to make sure it doesn't happen again is because if it happened again, it wouldn't be the same surprise. You've already had the virtue. You're using efficient logic to make sure there's another surprise. Because if something bad happens and you don't efficiently work to correct it, well, then next it will happen again, but it won't have the same beauty. It won't have the same strike of beauty. It won't have the same shock. You will know You intentionally didn't fix it so that there was an opportunity to show, and actually then it's showing off. It's a discrete showing off. You're just like the person at hotel.com, bookings.com, creating a system for to set the board so you're not responsible for anything. If you don't intentionally do your best to fix the mic, to fix the space, then you're actually creating the system to make it seem like you're showing and not showing off, but actually it's a planned error, and actually therefore it's not virtuous, right? So the efficient is necessary to make sure that you never gamify virtue, right? It is not to replace virtue, it's to put the fire under virtue. Okay, you had that grace of error. You must now fix this. You must fix bookings.com. Yes, thank you, bookings. You must fix it because you cannot rest on the laurels of your past errors that were opportunities for beauty, right? So the efficiency of the fixing of error is after the error, not before the error to make sure the error doesn't occur. It is after the error precisely to make space for another surprise so that it could be virtuous, so that you could actually rise to its occasion and it not be egotistical. So the order must be the efficient comes for the sake of not letting yourself gamify error so that you can continue to show instead of showing off. Because even if the people around you didn't know the difference, you would know the difference, and that would eat at your soul. And it would also stop demanding something of you. It would stop having that call of beauty. And you actually would not be letting be the error. You would be gamifying. It's almost like letting and gamifying are different. And yes, we have all sorts of booking names for the website, so bookings.com can be happy with us. But again, in an age of people that do not gain capacity, that do not have a logic of beauty, then there's no way to think about efficiency other than removing error versus that which makes sure there's always a surprise. And so the recovery of lack is not nothing, the recovery of beauty and the emphasis on this gaining of capacity and virtue is all necessary for the right order of efficient thinking. If we do not do this, then efficient thinking will continue to be in service of a discrete banality of evil that will manifest through our technological system so that we can tell ourselves we're good people while we're incapable of the good until the day comes the banality of bookings.com. Yes. That's exactly right. That's Michelle and I is going to be our journal entry. And so we will continue to let efficient logic lead us to a place where we are just like Eichmann. I was just doing my job. There's nothing we can do. And we must do everything in our power to make sure that we are never the kind of people of whom can say there is nothing we can do, because there's always something we can do. And precisely then the fact that this world always has the possibility of error means there is always an opportunity to let the grace come through. And in that way, it is good. And it is completely adequate because we can never completely remove the capacity to walk into a bar and have to give a presentation of which we can remember as beautiful. And that's a good thing. It's been a pleasure. Thank you all. I've enjoyed it much.